It was never about the gold. Gold was simply a malleable medium, easily melted down and reshaped to fit the wearer's current vanity or financial ruin. It was about the tiny, hand-carved obsidian rose nestled inside the silver filigree, an earring I had spent 3 grueling weeks crafting under a dusty desk lamp. When I lost it running blindly from the gala, I thought my secret was safe. I didn't expect the most dangerous man in the city to find it lying on the marble floor, and I certainly didn't expect him to use it to find me. At 9:00 p.m. on the night of the Boston Gala, the Beacon Hill Historical Society was hosting a masterclass in aggressive, suffocating wealth. Heavy velvet curtains, dyed a deep, imposing crimson, draped from the 20-foot ceilings of the grand ballroom, absorbing the ambient chatter of Boston's elite. Crystal chandeliers, massive tiered constructions of authentic French crystal, threw fractured, dazzling light over a sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer silk gowns. The air smelled of expensive, smoky oud wood, spilled vintage champagne, and the kind of careless privilege that I could never afford. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with silver trays, offering caviar and impossible luxuries to people who barely looked at them. I stood near the perimeter of the room, my back pressed lightly against a cold marble pillar, adjusting the hidden safety pin at the waist of my simple burgundy dress. It was a second-hand piece, found in a vintage shop in Cambridge and altered by my own hands on a rented sewing machine, completely out of place among the authentic Dior and Chanel that filled the floor. Yet, as the hired expert, I was exactly where I needed to be. I had perfected the art of being invisible, a skill that served me well as Lauren Mitchell, the appraiser nobody noticed. At 26, burdened by mounting medical debt from my late mother's illness, thick stacks of final notices threatening collection agencies, and struggling to keep my mentor Arthur Pendleton's dusty West End restoration shop afloat, being unnoticed was a survival tactic. Arthur had taken me in when I had nothing but grief and the overwhelming scent of hospital antiseptic clinging to my threadbare clothes. He taught me how to read the microscopic history of precious stones, how to understand the violent pressure that formed them deep within the earth. I owed him my career, my sanity. Tonight, I had been hired as a freelance inventory appraiser for the charity auction exhibition. My job was straightforward, mechanical, and entirely unglamorous. Stand near the glass display cases, monitor the historical jewelry, and verify that the pieces being paraded before drunken billionaires matched the archival ledgers. They didn't pay me enough to mingle. They barely paid me enough to cover my monthly electricity bill. But the sheer proximity to these ancient masterful creations fed a hunger in my soul that money rarely satisfied. It was the only reason I had agreed to step into this glittering snake pit. I turned my attention back to the central display case, my calloused fingers tracing the edge of the reinforced glass. Inside rested a rare diamond necklace flanked by a supposedly flawless royal blue sapphire pendant. The guests walked past the station in continuous waves, offering shallow gasps and empty praises, blinded by the total carat weight and the highly polished platinum settings. They saw the price tag, the status symbol, the social leverage they could gain by bidding on such a piece. I saw the geological violence, the centuries of intense subterranean pressure, and the subtle human deception hidden within the facets. I leaned closer, my breath briefly fogging the pristine glass before the ambient air conditioning whisked it away. The sapphire pendant was highly controversial in gemological circles. The auction catalog listed it as an untreated, natural pristine stone, a bold claim that justified its astronomical reserve price of $2 million. But under the harsh, direct halogen lighting of the display, my trained eyes caught the subtle, telltale signs of human interference. The color zoning was far too sharp, too concentrated near the culet at the base of the stone, indicating artificial color diffusion. More importantly, the internal rutile silk, tiny, needle-like inclusions of titanium dioxide that naturally form within unheated sapphires, giving them a sleepy, velvety appearance, had been completely dissolved. It was a heat-treated stone, baked in a high-temperature furnace to artificially enhance its saturation and burn away its natural cloudy imperfections. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but it was a carefully constructed lie marketed as a miracle. It was the kind of forgery that ruined reputations, if anyone possessed the courage to point it out. I stared at the sparkling gems on the black velvet, like stars collapsing in a midnight sky. The rare diamond necklace surrounding the deceptive sapphire was a genuine masterpiece of the late 19th century. The stones were old mine cuts, their slightly asymmetrical facets and high crowns catching the light with a chunky, romantic fire that modern, computer-guided laser-cutting technology simply could not replicate. I mentally cataloged the slight, barely visible chips on the girdle of the third diamond from the left, cross-referencing it with the heavy appraisal notes I had memorized that morning at my cramped kitchen table. My mind worked best in these quiet, clinical categorizations. It was a deeply ingrained defense mechanism. When the overwhelming anxiety of my daily life, the final notices from the hospital billing department, the threats from the bank regarding Arthur Pendleton's shop lease, the sheer exhaustion of working 14-hour days just to survive, threatened to drown me, I compartmentalized. I focused purely on the physical, measurable truths of carbon, corundum, and precious metals. The jewelry never lied to me. The metals and stones held their history openly, waiting only for someone competent enough to read their microscopic scars. The string quartet in the corner of the grand ballroom shifted to a slow, melancholic movement, the deep sound of the cellos vibrating faintly through the polished hardwood floor beneath my worn heels. I took a slow, measured sip of the sparkling water I had been nursing for 2 solid hours, letting the cold liquid soothe my painfully dry throat. The burgundy dress clung tightly to my ribs, the synthetic fabric scratching slightly against my skin. It was a constant, tactile reminder of the vast socioeconomic canyon, separating me from everyone else in this room. Socialites draped in authentic Cartier Panthers, and men flashing heavy Patek Philippe chronographs, brushed past my station, their eyes sliding over my form as if I were merely an architectural fixture. I preferred it that way. Complete invisibility granted me the freedom to observe, to analyze, and to protect myself from the predatory nature of high society. My fingers instinctively moved to my left earlobe, gently tracing the intricate silver filigree of my own creation, the obsidian earring. It was a piece of my very soul, a tiny, hand-carved black rose encased in a delicate, geometric web of sterling silver that I had spent countless midnight hours soldering, filing, and polishing in the back room of the restoration shop, breathing in the scent of hot metal and grinding dust. It was my professional signature, the only piece of true unapologetic art I allowed myself to wear in public. It carried the heavy weight of my ambition, a quiet, stubborn rebellion against the mass-produced, soulless luxury that surrounded me tonight. Every petal of that dark stone had been shaped by my own hands, meticulously carved under a magnifying loupe, until my eyes burned, representing a resilience I had to force myself to feel. I dropped my hand, letting out a quiet, controlled breath, and returned my gaze to the fraudulent sapphire. I was just an underpaid appraiser. It wasn't my place to expose the auction house's lucrative deception to the oblivious bidders. I just had to stand there, maintain my posture, do my job, and collect my meager check at the end of the long night. But the carefully curated atmosphere in the ballroom suddenly shifted. It wasn't a specific sound, but rather the heavy, terrifying absence of it. The low, buzzing hum of wealthy conversation began to die out in a rapid, rippling wave, starting from the grand mahogany entrance doors and spreading swiftly toward the center of the room. The string quartet faltered abruptly, the lead violinist missing a beat before nervously recovering with a trembling bow, the music sounding thin and fragile in the sudden silence. The temperature in the room seemed to physically plummet, a sudden icy pressure settling over the previously relaxed crowd like a suffocating blanket. I didn't need to look up from the display case to know that a predator had just entered the territory. The crowd parted with a desperate, silent urgency, wealthy heirs and powerful politicians alike stepping aside to clear a wide path. Nobody wanted to be caught standing in his way. I finally lifted my gaze from the glass, my breath catching painfully in my throat. Dante Valerius did not walk, he commanded space. The enigmatic boss of Boston's underworld moved with a terrifying, predatory grace that demanded absolute submission from the room. He wore a pristine, charcoal bespoke suit that draped perfectly over his broad, imposing shoulders, the cut and fabric screaming of old European money and ruthless, untouchable power. His presence was a dark, gravitational pull, warping the very air around him. The men in the room lowered their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their expensive shoes, while the ladies cast covert, terrified yet mesmerized glances at his sharp, aristocratic profile. He was violence wrapped in cashmere and silk, a sovereign ruler operating entirely outside the boundaries of the law these politicians claimed to uphold. I froze, my muscles locking in a primal fear response, as his path led him directly toward the central display case. Toward me. I tried to press myself further back into the shadows of the marble pillar, desperately hoping my perfected invisibility would shield me. But as the towering man stopped in front of the glass, a mere 2 feet away, the heavy scent of petrichor, aged whiskey, and danger washed over me. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at me. His gaze, dark and unreadable, was fixed entirely on the rare diamond necklace and the fraudulent sapphire pendant. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound between us was the faint, nervous music from the quartet across the room. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, the frantic rhythm threatening to expose my terror. I kept my eyes focused on the lapel of his immaculate suit, too intimidated to look up at his face. "A rather impressive display," Dante murmured, his tone lowering to a near whisper that sent a sudden, involuntary shiver down my spine. It was smooth, cultured, and laced with an underlying authority that expected immediate compliance. I swallowed hard, forcing my vocal cords to function. "It is, sir," I managed to say quietly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and deferential. He slowly turned his head, his gaze finally locking onto mine. His eyes were the color of thunderclouds, ancient and remarkably cold, evaluating me with a surgical precision that stripped away every layer of my carefully constructed armor. The syndicate leader wasn't looking at my second-hand burgundy dress or my cheap heels. He was looking at the intelligence I desperately tried to hide. "You are the appraiser hired to authenticate this collection," he stated. It wasn't a question, it was a deeply researched fact. "Yes." "Lauren Mitchell," I replied, the professional instinct kicking in, overriding my panic. I stood a little taller, refusing to let my hands tremble as I clasped them tightly in front of me. Dante stepped marginally closer. The ambient noise of the gala seemed to fade entirely, isolating us in a tense, highly charged bubble. "Then tell me, Miss Mitchell, what is your professional opinion of the blue sapphire?" The trap was set. He was testing me. A man of his immense power and resources likely already knew the truth about the stones. If I lied to protect the auction house, I would prove myself to be just another corrupt, incompetent pawn in this room. If I told the truth, I risked my job and the meager paycheck I desperately needed to survive. My pride, stubborn and unyielding, flared to life, burning away the edges of my fear. "It is a beautiful stone," I said slowly, my voice steadying. "But it has never seen an untouched mountain mine, and it has absolutely seen the inside of a high-temperature furnace." A faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his stoic expression. The coldness in his eyes, thawed for a fraction of a second, replaced by a sharp, intense gleam of genuine interest. "The auction catalog guarantees its natural origin." The powerful boss countered smoothly, his tone challenging, pushing me to defend my bold assertion. "The catalog is selling a fantasy to people with more money than observational skills," I replied, the words slipping out before my practical mind could censor my bitter honesty. I immediately bit the inside of my cheek, regretting the sharp edge in my tone, but the imposing man didn't look offended. He looked fascinated. "Explain," he demanded softly. "The color zoning near the culet is too distinct," I explained, shifting smoothly into my element, the technical details anchoring my racing pulse. "Natural. Untreated sapphires possess a velvety softness due to microscopic rutile silk inclusions scattered throughout the crystal lattice. This specific stone lacks that silk. It has been dissolved by extreme thermal enhancement to artificially saturate the blue. Furthermore, the facet junctions show slight abrasion under magnification, a sign of rapid commercial polishing rather than the careful, slow hand finishing a truly natural, high-value stone of this caliber would demand. It's a very high-quality heat-treated stone from Madagascar, not a natural, unheated specimen. Selling it as the latter is a deliberate multi-million-dollar fraud." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Dante stared at me, his gaze dropping briefly to my lips before returning to my eyes. The sheer intensity of his focus was suffocating, making the air in my lungs feel incredibly thin. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate, ensuring I didn't flinch away. He withdrew his hand and opened his large leather-gloved palm. Resting on the dark leather was a ring. It wasn't a modern piece. It was heavy, crafted from high karat, deeply yellow gold that spoke of centuries past. The bezel was large, set with a flat, unpolished bloodstone that bore a faded, intricate crest. "Since you possess such a ruthless dedication to the truth," Dante said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that felt entirely too intimate for a crowded ballroom, "tell me what you see here." The poison chamber ring. I hesitated, my professional curiosity violently warring with my instinct to run. Slowly, carefully, I reached out. My fingertips briefly brushed against the cold leather of his glove as I picked up the artifact. A sudden, electric spark of tension jolted up my arm, but I forced myself to ignore it, bringing the heavy gold piece closer to the light of the chandelier. The weight was significant, pulling at the muscles in my hand. The gold was soft, likely 22 karat, showing the microscopic scratches and rich, buttery patina of hundreds of years of wear against human skin and thick brocade fabrics. But it was the architecture of the piece that immediately drew my analytical mind. The bezel setting holding the bloodstone was unusually thick, elevating the gem higher than technically necessary for a simple cabochon cut. The gold here was unyielding, purposeful. The prongs were integrated into a continuous gallery wire that looked decorative, but structurally it was designed to conceal. I turned the ring over, examining the underside of the setting where it met the finger. My thumbnail, filed short for precision work, caught on a microscopic seam hidden within the ornate, scrolling engravings along the band. It was a mechanism invisible to an untrained eye. I applied a tiny amount of lateral pressure to a specific grooved leaf near the shank. With a soft mechanical click that felt heavy with history, the top of the ring, bloodstone and all, swung open on a microscopic, perfectly engineered hinge. It revealed a tiny hollowed-out compartment beneath the stone, the interior gold slightly discolored by centuries-old chemical residue. My breath hitched. "A historical gold Medici ring," I whispered, looking up at him in absolute awe, the fear entirely eclipsed by reverence for the craftsmanship. Late 16th century. The alloy blend is distinctly Florentine, and the engineering of the hidden hinge is remarkable. It's a classic poison chamber ring, designed to hold a lethal dose of arsenic or belladonna, easily tipped into a rival's wineglass during a toast. I closed the hidden compartment with a soft snap and held the ancient weapon back out to him. It belongs in a highly secure museum vault, not in a suit pocket. Dante did not take the object immediately. He stood perfectly still, his towering frame casting a long shadow over me, sheltering me from the glaring lights of the room. The ruthless mafia boss was completely silent, his steely gaze narrowing slightly, as he processed what he had just witnessed. I had expected anger, or at least a condescending dismissal. Instead, I saw profound recognition. He was mesmerized not by my simple dress, not by the physical attributes that the men in this room usually valued, but by the sharp, unapologetic intellect I had just displayed. In a world full of sycophants, liars, and people desperate to tell him what he wanted to hear, I had just read the hidden, deadly truth of his artifact without a single moment of hesitation. "You see beneath the surface of things, Lauren," he finally said quietly, speaking my first name with a slow, deliberate cadence that made my heart stutter. It sounded like a vow. "You see the flaws, the history, the hidden poison. That is a very rare, very dangerous talent." He gently plucked the heavy gold ring from my palm. As he did, the rough pad of his thumb deliberately grazed the sensitive skin of my inner wrist. It wasn't an accidental touch. It was a calculated, searing brand that sent a flush of heat straight to my chest, entirely contrasting the chilly, cavernous drafts of the high-ceilinged ballroom. The sudden warmth bloomed up my arm, settling back onto her shoulders like a familiar, suffocating blanket of awareness. He was testing my physical reaction just as intensely as he had tested my professional knowledge. "Keep your eyes open tonight," Dante added, his tone shifting back to the grave, stoic sovereign. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the oblivious, laughing crowd of elite socialites with open, chilling contempt. "This room is full of forgeries, and not all of them are made of stone." He looked back down at me, the sheer intensity of his stare pinning me to the marble pillar. I was entirely consumed by the gravity of his presence, the exhaustion of my daily financial struggles, momentarily erased by the terrifying, thrilling reality of standing in the direct crosshairs of Dante Valerius. I opened my mouth to reply, to ask exactly what he meant by that dark warning, but the words died instantly in my throat. A sudden, piercing security alarm shattered the tense, curated atmosphere of the grand ballroom. It was a harsh, mechanical wail that screamed like a siren in a silent room, instantly tearing through the sophisticated hum of the Boston elite. Above us, the massive crystal chandeliers flickered and died, plunging the vast space into a terrifying darkness for a split second before the backup generators engaged. The room was suddenly bathed in a harsh, strobing red emergency light, painting the wealthy crowd in violent, bloody hues. Absolute panic erupted. The refined socialites and powerful politicians dissolved into a terrified, surging mob. Guests shrieked, tripped over the heavy silk hems of their designer gowns as they scrambled away from the display cases. Men shoved past waiters, sending silver trays of caviar and champagne crashing against the polished marble floor in an explosion of shattered glass and spilled wine that spread across the white tiles like blood seeping through gauze. Survival instinct overrode my paralysis. I ripped my gaze away from Dante Valerius, spinning on my worn heels. I didn't look back to see how the stoic sovereign reacted to the sudden chaos. He was the apex predator in this room, entirely immune to the panic, but I was just prey. This room was a trap, and I had to get out. I pushed through the terrified, suffocating mass of bodies. My eyes locked on the heavy oak doors of the service exit near the kitchens. The air grew stifling, thick with the scent of spilled alcohol, expensive perfume, and raw, unfiltered fear. A panicked man in a torn tuxedo slammed violently into my shoulder. I stumbled hard, my breath punching out of my lungs, but I forced myself to stay upright, recovering my balance just as another frantic guest pushed past me. In the violent crush, a flailing hand or a snagged piece of fabric caught the side of my head. I felt a sharp, sudden pull on my left earlobe, accompanied by a quick, stinging pain. The delicate silver filigree wire snapped with a tiny, almost inaudible ping. I reached up blindly, my fingers brushing against my bare skin. The sculpted volcanic glass earring was gone, but I couldn't stop to search the chaotic floor. The terrified crowd propelled me forward, spitting me out through the service doors into the bitter, freezing wind of the Boston night. My breath plumed in the frigid air, my heart hammering a frantic, staccato rhythm against my ribs as I ran down the dark alleyway. I was safe, swallowed by the shadows, entirely oblivious to the fact that I had just left my professional signature, a piece of my very soul, lying on the ballroom floor, and I had left it directly in the path of the most dangerous man in the city. The jagged brick walls of the alleyway blurred into a continuous, suffocating tunnel of freezing darkness as I ran. The bitter Boston wind howled through the narrow corridor between the high-rise buildings, slicing through the thin, synthetic fabric of my second-hand burgundy dress like a collection of icy blades. My breath plumed in the frigid air, tearing through my burning lungs as I forced my legs to carry me further away from the Beacon Hill Gala. Every gasp tasted of adrenaline and winter. The cracked, uneven asphalt tore at the worn soles of my cheap heels with every frantic step, sending sharp, agonizing jolts up my calves, but the sheer, blinding terror pumping through my veins refused to let me slow down. The ambient sirens of the city's emergency vehicles began to wail in the distance, a chaotic symphony of flashing lights and public panic that I desperately needed to avoid. I had no alibi to offer the authorities, no social standing to shield me from questioning, and absolutely no legal protection in a room full of panicked billionaires looking for a scapegoat. I kept running. As I finally rounded the corner onto a dimly lit commercial street in the West End, the immediate threat of the surging crowd faded, replaced by the acute, stinging physical reality of my escape. I slowed to a harsh, gasping jog, leaning heavily against a damp, graffiti-covered brick wall to steady my trembling legs. The sharp, coppery taste of fear flooded the back of my throat, thick and metallic. I reached a shaking hand up to my left earlobe, my numb, frozen fingers brushing against the raw, torn skin. A single drop of blood had already begun to crystallize in the freezing air, staining my fingertips. The delicate silver filigree wire had snapped entirely, the sharp edge of the metal biting into my lobe. My meticulously fashioned dark stone earring was gone. The realization hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow, temporarily eclipsing the terror of the security breach. That tiny, meticulously crafted piece of jewelry was not just an accessory. It was my professional signature, the only tangible proof of my artistic capability in a world that consistently undervalued my existence and dismissed my expertise. I had spent 3 grueling weeks at my cramped kitchen table, squinting through a scratched jeweler's loupe under a flickering desk lamp, until my vision blurred and my temples throbbed, just to perfect the microscopic curves of that black stone. My hands had cramped repeatedly, the cheap tools slipping and slicing into my cuticles, but I had refused to stop. Every single petal of the obsidian rose had been shaped by my own bleeding fingers. The silver wire had been heated and bent with painstaking precision, mirroring the fragile, complicated cage I had built around my own life. It was my armor. It was the quiet, Stubborn resilience I wore to remind myself that I was a creator, a master artisan, not just a struggling appraiser drowning in the lower class. And now, it was lying somewhere on the polished marble floor of a crime scene, lost forever among the trampled designer silk and shattered crystal. I pushed off the wet brick wall, wrapping my arms tightly around my shivering torso as I began the long, agonizing walk back toward the gritty reality of my neighborhood. The glittering, aggressive wealth of the charity auction felt like a fever dream now, replaced by the harsh, flickering yellow glow of broken street lamps and the smell of wet pavement and rotting garbage. I forced my analytical mind to compartmentalize the devastating loss of the earring, shifting my focus to the terrifying interaction that had preceded the chaos. My racing thoughts obsessively dismantled the architecture of the historical gold poison chamber ring he had handed me. The heavy gold of the bezel setting had felt unnervingly warm against my skin, a tactile echo of the centuries of violence and political betrayal it had silently witnessed in the courts of Florence. The micro-hinge was a marvel of Renaissance engineering, designed to operate with a silent, lethal fluidity that modern jewelers struggled to replicate, even with laser-guided milling machines. The internal cavity, severely discolored by ancient toxic residue, was a masterpiece of concealed destruction. It was a historical gold poison chamber ring, an artifact of pure calculated lethality. Dante Valerius had not shown me that artifact to boast about his illegal undocumented collection. He had handed it to me as a surgical calculated test of my competence, and I had opened it. I had exposed the hidden poison without a single moment of hesitation. A sudden flush of heat traveled up my freezing arms as the ghost of his touch returned. The rough pad of his leather glove grazing the sensitive skin of my inner wrist had been a deliberate, searing brand that cut through the cold of the ballroom. It was a terrifying paradox. The sovereign ruler of the city's underworld, a man whose mere presence caused prominent politicians to cower and look at their shoes, had looked at me with profound, absolute recognition. He had seen past the cheap burgundy dress. He had seen the sharp intellect and the desperation I used to survive. It was a highly dangerous, intoxicating validation that made my chest tighten with an unfamiliar, heavy ache. I had spent my entire life, mastered the skill of remaining unseen, hiding my bruises and my brilliance alike. Yet in a room of 500 people, the ultimate predator had locked directly onto me. By the time I fumbled with the rusted keys to my apartment building, my entire body was shaking with a dangerous mixture of hypothermia and delayed shock. The narrow stairwell smelled of boiled cabbage, damp carpet, and quiet desperation, a sharp sensory grounding in my socioeconomic reality. I locked the deadbolt behind me, leaning my back against the chipped paint of the door as I slid down to the cracked linoleum floor. The silence in my apartment was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and tasted of stale coffee and impending ruin. The pale moonlight filtered through the single unwashed window, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the thick stack of envelopes resting ominously on the laminate kitchen counter. Final notices, collection warnings, the staggering, insurmountable weight of my late mother's medical bills waiting to devour my next non-existent paycheck. Medical debt was a relentless tide, and I was drowning one unopened envelope at a time. The meager fee I was supposed to receive for tonight's appraisal, a small lifeline I had desperately counted on to keep the lights on, was likely tied up indefinitely in the police investigation of the security breach. Tomorrow I would have to face Arthur Pendleton at the dusty jewelry restoration shop in the West End. Arthur was a kind mentor, but his low-income shop barely generated enough revenue to pay my minimum wage, let alone cover the staggering mountain of medical debt waiting on my counter. My bank account was overdrawn. I pulled my knees to my chest, closing my eyes against the stinging tears of pure exhaustion. I had survived the night, but the physical absence of my self-crafted, obsidian jewelry against my jawline felt like a phantom limb, a constant reminder of everything I had lost and everything I still stood to lose. I just had to hope that in the massive, highly publicized fallout of the gala, the ruthless mafia boss would completely forget about the quiet appraiser who had deciphered his deadly ring. The only sound in the claustrophobic space was the frantic, uneven rasp of my own breathing, a small and desperately lonely noise against the crushing weight of the dark. 3 miles away, the Beacon Hill Historical Society was a masterclass in manufactured hysteria. The harsh, strobing red emergency lights painted the grand ballroom in violent, rhythmic flashes, transforming the sophisticated charity auction into a chaotic nightmare. The elite socialites, entirely stripped of their dignified veneers, shrieked and scrambled toward the mahogany exit doors in a desperate, undignified herd. Shattered champagne flutes and crushed caviar, blinnies littered the pristine white marble tiles, completely destroyed beneath the frantic stampede of bespoke leather shoes and expensive stilettos. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of panic, sweat, and spilled alcohol. Women in $1,000 silk gowns pushed blindly past one another, leaving a trail of discarded designer clutches, broken pearls, and ruined reputations in their wake. Men who routinely orchestrated corporate hostile takeovers were now shoving catering staff aside to save themselves. Dante Valerius did not move. He stood perfectly still near the center display case, a towering, monolithic presence of absolute calm amidst the pathetic display of wealthy cowardice. The strobing red lights reflected sharply off the crisp lines of his charcoal suit, casting long, imposing shadows across his aristocratic features. His piercing gaze swept over the surging crowd with cold, clinical detachment. He watched a prominent federal judge aggressively shove a weeping heiress out of the way to reach the exit faster. It was exactly as he had always known. The people who wrote the laws were entirely devoid of the honor required to uphold them. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots approached from his blind side. Dante did not flinch, instantly recognizing the specific, measured cadence of his security chief. Marcus Thorne materialized from the shadows of a damaged marble pillar, his dark, tailored tactical suit, seamlessly blending into the chaos of the room. The enforcer's expression was carved from the same unyielding stone as his boss, entirely unaffected by the screaming crowd around them. "Amateur breach on the outer southern perimeter, boss," Marcus reported, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the ambient wailing of the security sirens. A disorganized crew tried to hit the loading docks to bypass the vault heavily. They tripped the thermal sensors before they even breached the reinforced drywall. The local police are already swarming the front perimeter. Our extraction vehicles are waiting at the secondary subterranean exit. It is time to leave. Dante slowly turned his gaze away from the fleeing crowd, his expression completely devoid of concern regarding the attempted robbery. The syndicate's assets were secure. The fraudulent sapphire remained locked behind the reinforced glass, irrelevant and exposed. His mind was entirely occupied by the sharp, brilliant woman who had just vanished into the freezing night. "The perimeter is handled," Dante stated quietly, the absolute authority in his resonant baritone leaving no room for debate. "We will proceed to the extraction point. Secure the venue and withdraw our personnel." Without another glance at the frantic elites, Dante turned and walked toward the subterranean exit, his imposing figure swallowed by the shadows as he left the compromised venue behind. 10 hours later, at 7 a.m., the next morning, the Beacon Hill Historical Society was a silent, heavily guarded crime scene. The violent red strobes of the night before had been replaced by the flat, unforgiving gray light of the early morning. Dante Valerius stood inside the ruined ballroom, having easily bypassed the local police barricades with a single phone call. The floor was still littered with crushed glass and dried champagne stains, but Dante ignored the wreckage. He retraced the exact, precise path Lauren Mitchell had taken. His polished shoes crunched softly over the shattered crystal, his sharp eyes scanning the destruction with calculated intent. He pushed through the heavy oak service doors, stepping out of the stifling, stale air of the ballroom, and into the biting, damp morning of the Boston alleyway. The storm from the previous night had finally passed, leaving behind a freezing morning dew that coated the heavy granite steps leading down to the service alleyway. The area was deserted, the early daylight offering a stark, silent contrast to the deafening hysteria that had consumed the venue hours ago. Dante stood at the top of the stairs, the cold wind barely registering against his skin as his gaze swept over the wet, rain-slicked stone. He saw it instantly, resting precariously on the edge of the third granite step, catching the faint, pale glow of the rising sun, was a tiny glint of silver. Dante descended the stairs with a slow, deliberate grace. He knelt on the wet stone, the immaculate fabric of his bespoke trousers creasing perfectly, entirely indifferent to the freezing puddle soaking into the expensive wool. He extended his hand, his large, leather-gloved fingers delicately pinching the tiny object to lift it from the harsh granite. He held the obsidian earring up to the dim morning light, his eyes narrowing in intense professional scrutiny. It was a staggering piece of microarchitecture. The silver filigree was woven with a desperate, stubborn precision, forming a delicate geometric cage designed to fiercely protect the dark stone within. He rolled the earrings slowly between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the microscopic, uneven ridges along the silver wire. A mass-produced, machine-milled piece of jewelry would be flawlessly smooth, devoid of any human fingerprint. This was different. This bore the tiny, nearly invisible tool marks of a diamond-tipped file wielded by human hands. It was the work of someone who understood the fundamental anatomy of metal and stone. His gaze dropped to the fragile, hand-carved obsidian rose nestled deep inside the silver web. The specific gravity of the volcanic glass was dense, its dark, reflective surface absorbing the ambient light rather than reflecting it. The petals were asymmetrical, shaped with a meticulous, agonizing patience that required hundreds of hours under a magnifying loupe. Dante knew the exact, excruciating toll this level of craftsmanship took on a jeweler's eyes and hands, the cramping of muscles, the fine silver dust coating the skin. The girl in the cheap, second-hand burgundy dress had not purchased this piece from a high-end boutique. She had forged it herself. It was a physical manifestation of her quiet, unyielding pride. She was a master artisan, trapped in a world that only valued the superficial shine of fraudulent sapphires. The sharp, metallic scent of the broken filigree wire met his senses, confirming the violence with which it had been torn from her ear in the panicked crowd. She had bled. She had fled into the freezing rain, abandoning her professional signature, just to escape the chaos of a world she didn't belong to. Marcus Thorne stepped out quietly onto the granite landing above, the heavy oak doors closing with a dull thud behind him. He looked down at his employer, his posture rigid and waiting. Dante slowly lowered his hand, safely depositing the fragile, hand-carved obsidian, rose into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket, right next to the deadly, historical gold poison chamber ring she had so brilliantly deciphered. The contrast between the ancient instrument of assassination and the delicate symbol of her resilience settled heavily against his chest. "The girl," Dante said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register that resonated with absolute, chilling command over the sound of the morning wind. Marcus stepped down one granite stair, his posture straightening. "The appraiser boss?" "Lauren Mitchell," Dante corrected smoothly, speaking her full name with a grave, proprietary weight that lent a sharp, absolute finality to the freezing morning air. "She operates entirely outside the typical circles of the elite. She has a rare, dangerous talent for seeing the flaws in the foundation, the hidden poison beneath the gold. I want to know where she learned to read stones with such ruthless accuracy." He turned slowly, looking back up at his loyal enforcer. The storm gray of his eyes was darker now, an obsidian depth that matched the stone resting in his pocket. "Trace the maker's mark on her work, locate her residence. Discover who holds her debts, who signs her meager paychecks, and what burdens she is carrying that put that level of exhaustion in her eyes," Dante commanded quietly. "But understand this clearly, Marcus. She is not a suspect. She is not a threat to be neutralized. When you locate her, you will treat her with the absolute, uncompromising respect due to a master of her craft." Dante looked back out into the cold, damp alleyway where she had disappeared, his jaw tightening with a stoic, protective warmth that he had not felt in over a decade. The elite world had ignored her brilliance, forcing her to shrink into the shadows to survive. But Dante Valerius did not ignore true value. "Track her down," Dante whispered into the freezing Boston morning, "and bring her to me." 3 days had passed since the terrifying chaos of the Beacon Hill Gala, and my life had seamlessly reverted to its grueling, invisible baseline. The relentless, biting cold of the Boston winter seeped through the poorly insulated, grime-streaked window panes of Arthur Pendleton's West End jewelry restoration shop, settling into my bones with a familiar, suffocating ache. I sat hunched over my scarred wooden workbench, a battered brass jeweler's loop pressed tightly to my right eye, entirely absorbed in the microscopic anatomy of a damaged Edwardian brooch. My calloused fingers, perpetually stained with dark silver polish and tiny healing cuts, gripped a pair of fine-tipped titanium tweezers. I was in the process of carefully removing a fractured, natural seed pearl from its delicate platinum setting, a task that required absolute, unforgiving precision. The microtorch hissed softly near my elbow, radiating a localized heat that starkly contrasted with the freezing drafts swirling around my ankles. The pungent, Metallic scent of soldering flux and acidic pickle solution saturated the cramped air of the back room, a chemical perfume that I had long ago learned to breathe without coughing. It was tedious, backbreaking labor that paid mere fractions of a living wage. I loved it. The physical act of restoration was the only thing keeping my escalating panic at bay. Every time I closed my eyes, the strobing red emergency lights of the charity auction flashed behind my eyelids, accompanied by the violent memory of the surging, terrified crowd. But more haunting than the security breach was the phantom weight on my left earlobe. The absence of my self-crafted obsidian jewelry was a constant, tactile reminder of my vulnerability. I had spent 3 weeks shaping that dark volcanic glass, filing the silver filigree web into a perfect protective cage, only to leave it lying on a marble floor in the direct path of the city's most feared syndicate boss. I constantly checked over my shoulder, irrationally terrified that the local police, or worse, the ruthless enforcers of the underworld, would kick down the splintering door of our shop to drag me away for questioning. I had honed the practice of escaping notice, but that night, standing under the crushing gravity of his imposing stare, I had been utterly, devastatingly seen. I carefully set the extracted seed pearl onto a soft square of black velvet, letting out a long, shaky breath. The silence in the shop was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and tasted of chemical flux and impending ruin. My gaze drifted past the tools to the thick, terrifying stack of envelopes, rubber banded together near my desk lamp. The final notices, the relentless, aggressive billing departments of the Boston General Hospital, demanding immediate payment for my late mother's extensive oncology treatments. Single motherhood was a relentless tide, but being the sole surviving daughter, buried under inherited medical debt, was its own specific kind of drowning. The meager fee I was owed for the gala appraisal was currently frozen in a bureaucratic police investigation, leaving my bank account hovering dangerously close to zero. The numbers simply did not add up. No matter how many 14-hour shifts I pulled at this cramped workbench, no matter how perfectly I restored the forgotten treasures of the wealthy, I was statistically destined to lose everything. The sheer, overwhelming injustice of it burned in my chest, a hot, bitter coal that I deliberately swallowed down every single morning. "You are going to ruin your eyesight, Lauren?" A gentle, raspy voice interrupted my dark spiraling. I pushed the loupe up to my forehead and blinked against the harsh glare of the halogen desk lamp. Arthur Pendleton stood in the narrow doorway separating the back workshop from the modest retail storefront. The elderly owner was a portrait of fading, artisanal pride. He was 72 years old, his spine permanently curved from 5 decades of leaning over a jeweler's block. He wore a frayed, oversized wool cardigan that smelled faintly of sweet pipe tobacco and old paper, his liver-spotted hands clutching a chipped ceramic mug. Arthur was a master silversmith whose traditional techniques had been rendered obsolete by mass-produced, computer-milled jewelry, leaving his historic shop to slowly decay in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. He had given me a job and a safe haven when the grief of losing my mother had nearly broken me in half. I owed him a loyalty that money could never quantify. "The platinum prongs on this piece are paper." "Thin, Arthur," I replied softly, accepting the warm mug of bitter black tea he offered. The ceramic transferred a desperate, much-needed heat into my freezing palms. "If I don't secure the new pearl perfectly, the entire gallery wire will collapse. I just need another hour. The brooch has survived a century of wear and tear, my dear. It can survive one more night in the safe," Arthur said kindly, though his pale blue eyes were clouded with the same financial anxiety that kept me awake at night. He turned his head slowly, peering through the open doorway toward the large, grime-streaked display window at the front of the shop. He frowned, his bushy white eyebrows drawing together in confusion. "Besides, I believe we have a rather unusual situation developing outside." I froze, the steaming tea suddenly burning my tongue. "What do you mean?" "There has been a vehicle parked at the curb for the last 10 minutes, the older man murmured, wiping his hands on a stained polishing cloth. "It is not the sort of automobile that typically frequents our dilapidated corner of the West End." I set the mug down on the bench with a sharp clatter, my pulse instantly spiking into a frantic, staccato rhythm. I pushed away from the workbench and walked cautiously into the dimly lit retail space. The glass display cases were old, their wooden frames chipped and the velvet linings faded by decades of sunlight, showcasing modest silver lockets and repaired pocket watches. I stood behind the main counter, and looked out through the condensation-blurred window. Idling directly in front of our crumbling brick storefront was a massive, matte black SUV. It was heavily armored, the suspension sitting unnervingly low over reinforced, military-grade tires. The windows were tinted an absolute, impenetrable black, offering no hint of the occupants inside. It looked like a mechanized beast of prey that had wandered far from its designated hunting grounds, its heavy diesel engine vibrating with a low, predatory hum that I could feel through the worn floorboards of the shop. This was not a lost tourist looking for the historic district. This was a highly coordinated, intentional presence. Perhaps they are merely checking a map, Arthur suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Before I could agree, the heavy front doors of the SUV swung open simultaneously. My breath caught painfully in my throat. I instinctively took a step backward, my hip bumping hard into the edge of the glass display case. The predator had just revealed itself, and every prey animal in the vicinity suddenly remembered what fear tasted like. The shop's brass bell, usually a cheerful, welcoming chime, shrieked with a sharp, jarring finality as the front door was pushed open. A blast of freezing winter air swept into the dusty room, immediately followed by the imposing, tactical frame of Marcus Thorne. Dante's loyal enforcer moved with a lethal, fluid grace that betrayed his military background. He wore a dark, meticulously tailored tactical suit that barely concealed the dangerous bulk of the weaponry harnessed beneath it. Marcus did not look at the silver lockets or the antique clocks. His dark, unreadable eyes executed a rapid, professional sweep of the room, identifying every possible exit, blind spot, and structural weakness in a fraction of a second. Without uttering a single word, he reached out, flipped the open sign to closed, and slid the heavy brass deadbolt into place. The loud, definitive click of the lock echoed through the silent shop like the slamming of a prison cell door. We were trapped. Then, Dante Valerius stepped over the threshold. The air pressure in the tiny retail space seemed to plummet instantly, violently sucking the oxygen from my lungs. The enigmatic boss of Boston's underworld was a towering, monolithic presence that made the low-ceilinged room feel suddenly, impossibly microscopic. He wore a pristine, bespoke charcoal overcoat draped elegantly over a three-piece suit, the expensive, heavy cashmere starkly contrasting with the peeling plaster and water-stained ceiling tiles of our reality. The olfactory shift was immediate and overwhelming. The harsh, chemical tang of soldering flux and sulfur was effortlessly erased by the rich, intoxicating scent of petrichor, sharp winter wind, and highly expensive aged whiskey. He was a sovereign ruler stepping into a peasant's hovel, carrying an aura of absolute, untouchable command that demanded immediate submission. I stood frozen behind the glass counter, my muscles locked in a state of acute terror. My right hand blindly reached out, my fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, heavy steel of a specialized jeweler's hammer resting near the register. It was a pathetic, useless weapon against men of this caliber. But my survival instinct demanded. I hold onto something solid. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, the frantic beats deafening in my ears. He had found me. The police hadn't connected me to the alarm, but the syndicate had tracked me down in 3 days flat. Arthur, displaying a startling, reckless bravery that made my stomach drop, stepped out from behind the counter to place himself between me and the imposing men. His frail shoulders trembled slightly, but he raised his chin. "The shop is closed, gentlemen," my mentor stated, his voice tight. "Whatever debt you believe is owed, you have the wrong address. We have nothing of value here." Dante Valerius stopped in the center of the room. He did not look at the elderly man with anger or violence. Instead, his slate-colored eyes, ancient, calculating, and chillingly calm, swept over the silversmith with a quiet, dismissive respect. "Mr. Pendleton," Dante spoke, his resonant baritone vibrating through the tense air, smooth and laced with an inherent authority. "I am well aware of the state of your finances, the specific lease terms of this building, and the fact that you owe $14,000 to a predatory local supplier. But you may lower your guard. I am not a collector. I am not here to cause damage to your establishment." The Don slowly shifted his gaze, his dark obsidian eyes bypassing the brave old man to lock directly onto mine. The sheer intensity of his focus was a physical weight, pinning me to the floorboards. "I am here for her." "Lauren has done nothing wrong," Arthur insisted fiercely, though he instinctively took a half-step back from the sheer overwhelming gravity of the man's presence. "I am acutely aware of what Miss Mitchell has and has not done," Dante replied softly, never breaking eye contact with me. He unbuttoned his heavy cashmere overcoat with a slow, deliberate movement that telegraphed he was entirely unthreatened by my defensive posture. "May I approach your workspace, Lauren?" He used my first name with that same grave, proprietary cadence he had used in the ballroom. It wasn't a request, it was a polite inevitability. I swallowed hard, forcing my paralyzed vocal cords to function. "Yes," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and fragile. I slowly released my white-knuckled grip on the jeweler's hammer, realizing how utterly ridiculous I looked trying to defend myself against a man who could buy this entire city block with a single phone call. Dante stepped smoothly around the glass counter, ignoring the creaking floorboards beneath his expensive leather shoes. He stopped directly in front of me, leaving only 3 feet of charged, electrified space between us. Up close, the dangerous perfection of his aristocratic features was staggering. The sharp cut of his jaw, the faint silver scar interrupting the line of his left eyebrow, the absolute, chilling stillness of his posture. He looked down at my hands resting on the counter. He saw the dark silver polish staining my cuticles, the tiny burns from the micro-torch, the undeniable evidence of grueling, physical labor. "You have remarkably steady hands for someone who fled a ballroom in sheer, unadulterated terror," Dante noted quietly, his tone devoid of mockery. It was an analytical observation, measuring the vast discrepancy between my frightened demeanor and my highly competent skills. "I had no reason to stay, sir," I replied cautiously, lifting my chin to maintain eye contact, refusing to let him see how badly my knees were shaking. The appraisal was complete. The security breach was entirely outside the scope of my employment. "Indeed," the syndicate leader murmured, his eyes dropping briefly to my left earlobe. The raw red scratch left by the torn filigree wire had begun to heal, but the visual absence of the jewelry was glaring. "You move very quickly when you are afraid, Lauren. You blend into the shadows perfectly. A lesser man would have lost your trail entirely before you ever reached the service exit." "Then why are you here?" I demanded, a sudden, stubborn spark of pride overriding my fear. "If you know I had nothing to do with the attempted robbery at the gala, what possible business could the head of the Valerius Syndicate have in a failing restoration shop in the West End?" Dante did not answer immediately. The silence stretched between us, heavy and thick, with an unspoken, magnetic tension that made the air in my lungs feel impossibly thin. He reached a large, leather-gloved hand into the inner breast pocket of his bespoke suit jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate, ensuring I did not flinch away. He withdrew his hand and opened his palm over the scratched glass of the display counter. Resting against the dark leather was my bespoke dark glass earring. I stared at the tiny, intricately woven silver cage and the dark, asymmetrical volcanic rose nestled inside it. The metal was perfectly intact, though the top loop where it had violently torn from my ear remained slightly bent. A wave of profound, staggering relief crashed over me, instantly followed by a sharp spike of renewed paranoia. "You found it," I breathed, my professional mask slipping entirely to reveal the raw, desperate attachment I had to the piece. "I found it resting on the granite steps of the service alleyway," Dante confirmed, his pitch descending to an intimate register, meant only for me. He gently placed the delicate piece of jewelry onto the glass counter between us. "It is a staggering piece of micro-architecture. The specific gravity of the obsidian, the meticulous asymmetrical carving of the petals, the stubborn tension in the silver wire. It is not the work of a hired appraiser. It is the work of a master artisan." I looked up from the earring, my breath catching at the profound, genuine respect burning in his storm-gray eyes. He wasn't looking at me as a suspect or a pawn or a convenient victim. He was looking at my intellect. "How did you track me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't on the official guest list. The auction house hired me through a blind third-party vendor. I have no need for police reports or auction house records," the sovereign replied smoothly. He reached out, the tip of his leather-clad index finger gently tracing the outer curve of the silver filigree on the glass counter. I simply looked at the inner rim of the silver web under a macro lens. It carved a microscopic LM into the metal, a maker's mark. It took my intelligence network exactly 36 hours to cross-reference the unique soldering technique with independent artisanal registries in the Northeast. "You left your signature in the metal, Lauren. You wanted to be known, even if you hide in the dark." The accuracy of his psychological assessment felt like a physical intrusion. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, suddenly feeling incredibly exposed. It's just an earring. I'm just a restorer. You could have sent a courier to return it. I do not send couriers to handle irreplaceable assets, Dante stated, the absolute authority in his voice, leaving no room for argument. He shifted his stance, his towering frame casting a long, protective shadow over my small workspace. 3 days ago, you correctly identified a highly sophisticated, heat-treated sapphire forgery from 10 feet away, under terrible lighting, when a room full of alleged experts saw nothing but a pristine gemstone. You subsequently deciphered the mechanical architecture of a 16th-century Florentine poison ring in less than 60 seconds. Your competence is sharp, ruthless, and entirely wasted in a shop that is actively drowning in debt. He knew about the debt. Of course he knew. A man who could trace a microscopic maker's mark in a day would have absolutely no trouble uncovering the desperate, humiliating reality of my mother's hospital bills and my overdrawn bank accounts. Shame burned hot and bright in my cheeks, a stark contrast to the freezing draft in the room. My financial situation is none of your business, I snapped, my pride flaring violently as I grabbed the obsidian earring off the glass counter and clutched it to my chest. I am making it my business, Dante countered, entirely unbothered by my defensive anger. He leaned slightly closer, the scent of whiskey and power wrapping around me like a heavy, inescapable blanket. I possess a private, highly secure subterranean vault at my estate on Beacon Hill. It contains centuries of historical artifacts, precious stones, and syndicate ledgers. Recently, I have reason to believe that a trusted member of my inner circle is attempting to introduce sophisticated forgeries into my archives to mask their embezzlement. The sheer scale of the criminal conspiracy he was casually unveiling to me made the blood drain from my face. You want me to audit a mafia vault? Are you insane? I'm not getting involved in underworld politics. If I expose one of your people, they will kill me. No one will touch you, Dante promised. The words were spoken softly, but they carried the devastating, lethal weight of a blood oath. The cold, stoic sovereign vanished, replaced entirely by the terrifying, protective giant who ruled the shadows of this city. You will be working directly under my absolute protection. You will be compensated at a rate that will instantly eradicate your medical debts, secure Mr. Pendleton's lease for the next decade, and grant you the financial independence you have been brutally denied. I am not asking you to fire a weapon, Lauren. I am asking you to use the brilliant, uncompromising mind you are currently wasting in this dust. I stared at him, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The offer was a gilded cage, a terrifying plunge into a world built on violence and illicit power. But as I looked at the thick stack of final okodokuses sitting on my workbench, and then up into the ancient, unwavering storm-gray eyes of the man offering me absolute salvation, the line between danger and sanctuary blurred entirely. I was terrified of him. But for the first time in my life, standing directly in the crosshairs of a true predator, I finally felt safe. The heavy, suffocating silence in the dusty retail space pressed aggressively against my eardrums, broken only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of a broken antique pocket watch resting inside the display case. I was still clutching the hand-carved obsidian earring against my chest, the cold silver wire digging sharp, painful crescents into my palm. Dante Valerius remained perfectly still in the center of the cramped room. He was a towering, monolithic monument of bespoke charcoal cashmere and calculated stillness. He had just offered me a fortune to audit the historical vaults of his vast empire. The sheer, overwhelming audacity of the proposal should have sent me running blindly for the rusted back door of the shop, fleeing into the freezing winter morning just as I had fled the gala. Instead, my worn heels remained firmly planted on the warped, creaking floorboards. I could feel the tense, erratic pulse of the room. Arthur Pendleton stood in the deep shadows near the workshop entrance, his breathing shallow and rapid. My elderly mentor was clearly terrified of the lethal men occupying his establishment, but he stubbornly refused to abandon me. Marcus Thorne, the dark-suited enforcer, had not moved a single millimeter from the locked front door. He was a terrifying statue carved from tactical discipline, his dark, unreadable eyes continuously sweeping the quiet West End streets, outside through the narrow gaps in the dusty window blinds. We were completely sealed inside a pressure cooker of wealth, violence, and intoxicating possibility. Dante extended his right hand, palm facing upward. The dark, buttery leather of his glove stretched taut over his wide, powerful knuckles. "Give it to me, Lauren," he murmured. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that bypassed my auditory processing entirely. vibrating directly against my ribs like the deep, low notes of a cello. It wasn't a demand barked by a ruthless tyrant. It was a terrifyingly gentle request from a sovereign predator who knew he had already won. I looked down at his waiting hand, my mind a chaotic battlefield of logic and desperation. The rational, self-preserving part of my brain screamed at me to step back, to violently reject the gilded cage he was methodically building around me. But the exhausted, terrified woman who had been drowning in final medical notices, working 14-hour shifts until her fingers bled just to keep the lights on, saw a definitive lifeline. I took a shuddering breath that tasted of chemical flux and old dust. With measured, agonizing care, I opened my hand. My calloused fingers, stained dark with silver polish, trembled visibly as I placed the delicate piece of jewelry onto his leather-clad palm. The sovereign did not step back to examine the piece. Instead, he closed the remaining 3 feet of charged, electrified space between us. The ambient temperature in the cramped retail area seemed to violently spike. The freezing, bitter drafts swirling around my ankles were entirely neutralized by the sheer, radiating body heat of his large frame. The rich, intoxicating scent of aged single malt whiskey, sharp petrichor, and a distinctly masculine, smoky oud wood wrapped around my senses, completely overriding the harsh sulfur and acid of my daily reality. He was so close I could see the microscopic, silver threads woven into the charcoal wool of his suit lapel, a fabric that cost more than my entire annual rent. Dante reached up toward my face. His movements were deliberate, heavily telegraphed, and painstakingly gradual, offering my survival instincts every possible opportunity to pull away from his invading presence. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was utterly paralyzed, entirely mesmerized by the absolute contrast between his lethal, blood-soaked reputation and the careful surgical precision of his hands. The rough pad of his leather-clad thumb brushed lightly against my jawline. It was a searing electric contact that sent a violent, involuntary shiver racing down my spine. I inhaled sharply, my breath hitching audibly in my throat as he tilted my head slightly to the right, exposing my bare left earlobe to the dim, flickering light of the shop. The cold metal of the silver filigree touched my skin. He navigated the slightly bent wire with a shocking, effortless expertise that defied logical explanation, sliding it securely through the empty piercing. The silver stung for a fleeting instant against the raw, healing scratch left by the fleeing crowd. But the brief spark of pain was instantly eclipsed by the overwhelming, consuming tactile sensation of his heavy knuckles grazing the sensitive skin of my neck. He secured the tiny silver clasp with a soft, mechanical click that sounded deafening in the quiet room. The hand-carved obsidian rose was back where it belonged, heavy against my jaw, a physical anchor chaining me to the events of the gala. And now, to him, "You spent your life shrinking to fit into rooms that did not deserve your presence," Dante said quietly. His storm-gray eyes dropped to my trembling lips before locking intensely onto my gaze. The absolute certainty in his tone was staggering. It was as if he were reading the very DNA of my existence, pursing through my trauma and my fierce hidden pride with a single glance. "That ends today." His thumb lingered on the soft skin of my jaw for one heartbeat longer than strictly necessary before he lowered his hand, severing the electric connection and leaving my skin burning in the cold air. "You are no longer an underpaid appraiser hiding in the shadows of the West End," Dante declared, his posture straightening to its full, imposing height. "You are now my personal archive gemologist. Your expertise will dictate the future of my historical vaults, and your professional word will be the absolute law regarding every single artifact in my possession." The title hung in the dusty, chemical-tainted air, heavy and overwhelmingly intoxicating. Personal archive gemologist. It wasn't just a job offer, it was a profound, life-altering coronation. For years, I had successfully mastered the craft of blending into the background, meticulously analyzing multi-million-dollar gems, while wealthy, ignorant socialites completely ignored my existence. Arthur had taught me everything there was to know about the molecular structure of precious stones, but even he could only offer me a broken wooden stool and a meager hourly wage that failed to cover my basic survival. Dante Valerius was taking my brilliant, uncompromising mind and forcibly elevating it to a position of supreme, unassailable authority. He wasn't asking me to be a disposable pawn in his violent criminal empire. He was crowning me a queen of my craft, validating my intellect with a ferocity that made my eyes burn with sudden unshed tears. But the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the offer brought a renewed wave of logical panic crashing through my system. The initial shock of his touch began to fade, replaced by the razor-sharp analytical instincts that had kept me alive this long. I stepped backward, putting a crucial, necessary foot of space between us to clear my head of his overpowering, masculine scent. My mind, relentlessly trained to identify microscopic flaws in flawless diamonds, immediately began to stress test his proposal. "You are talking about plunging me into a world built entirely on violence," I said, my voice steadying as I drew on my deep well of professional composure, crossing my arms tightly over my chest to hide the lingering tremors in my hands. "You suspect a high-ranking, trusted member of your own inner circle of active embezzlement. If I step into your subterranean vault and expose a traitor through forensic appraisal, I instantly become a target. What does absolute protection actually mean, Mr. Valerius? Because in my bitter experience, men with power only protect their assets until those assets become a political liability." Dante's expression did not harden at my blatant defiance. He didn't bristle at being questioned by a woman in a cheap sweater. Instead, the faint, silver scar interrupting his left eyebrow shifted slightly as a ghost of a dark, approving smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He liked the pushback. He profoundly respected the fact that I wasn't blindly throwing myself into danger just because he was waving an unlimited checkbook in my face. "A fair, highly accurate assessment," the sovereign conceded smoothly, his baritone rumbling with dark amusement. He did not turn around to face the door, but he raised 2 fingers of his right hand in a silent, minimal tactical gesture. By the glass door, Marcus Thorne moved. The enforcer stepped away from the blinds, his heavy tactical boots completely silent on the creaking wooden floorboards. He approached the scratched display counter with the lethal efficiency of a hunting dog, withdrew a sleek, matte black leather folder from the inner pocket of his tactical jacket, placed it gently on the glass surface between Dante and me, and immediately retreated to his guard post without making a single sound. The sheer, unspoken discipline of the coordinated movement was chilling to witness. "I do not deal in vague promises or empty blood oaths, Lauren," Dante explained, gesturing gracefully toward the black leather folder. "I deal in binding, absolute agreements. Open it." I looked down at the matte leather, my heart hammering a relentless, deafening rhythm against my ribs. Cautiously, I reached out and flipped the heavy cover open. Inside lay a thick, impeccably organized stack of documents printed on heavy, high-quality archival paper. It was a formal, meticulously drafted legal contract. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense paragraphs of sophisticated legalese, my brain instantly recognizing the rigid structure of a high-level corporate retainer agreement. This wasn't a handwritten note of extortion from a mob boss. It was a legitimate, ironclad employment contract drafted by top-tier, exceptionally expensive attorneys. I read the paperwork with the same intense, surgical scrutiny I applied to examining a fractured emerald under a microscope, searching for the internal inclusions, the hidden traps, the structural weaknesses. I flipped to the compensation clause on the 3rd page, and all the oxygen violently left my lungs. The numbers printed cleanly on the page were staggering, almost incomprehensible to a woman who currently had $14 in her checking account. There was a guaranteed signing bonus listed that would instantly, permanently eradicate the towering, suffocating mountain of my late mother's medical debt. The monthly salary dwarfed the total revenue Arthur's entire shop generated in a decade. But it was the specific, highly detailed clauses buried beneath the financial figures that truly anchored me to the floorboards. Section 4, Dante narrated softly, watching the rapid, darting movement of my eyes as they tracked across the heavy paper. Full assumption of the commercial lease for this property, paid in advance for a period of 10 years, guaranteed under an anonymous corporate LLC. Mr. Pendleton will never have to worry about a predatory supplier, a gentrifying landlord, or an eviction notice ever again. I heard a sharp, choked gasp from the shadows of the workshop. Arthur had heard the terms. The crushing weight of his impending bankruptcy had just been erased by a single line of ink. Section 7 details your personal security protocol, Dante continued, his voice dropping to a grave, uncompromising register that brooked absolutely no defiance. You will be assigned a rotating, 24-hour detail of my most elite, highly vetted guards. No one approaches you, speaks to you, or enters your designated workspace without my explicit, personal authorization. And Section 9, your professional autonomy. You report solely, directly to me. No capo, no lieutenant, No underboss within my organization has the authority to question your analytical findings, alter your reports, or command your presence. I read the words 3 times over, my eyes burning as I searched for the hidden poison chamber within the gold. There was none. It was a flawless, impeccably structured contract, designed specifically to build an impenetrable, heavily armed fortress around my life. He was legally and financially isolating me from the crushing, humiliating poverty that had defined my entire adult existence, offering me a level of extreme physical and professional security that bordered on the obsessive. "You drafted this comprehensive contract in 3 days?" I asked, looking up at his imposing figure in sheer unadulterated disbelief. "I finalized the core parameters of this agreement 20 minutes after I found your broken earring on the granite steps of the alleyway." Dante corrected seamlessly, his storm-gray eyes completely serious. "The remaining 2 days were spent deploying my intelligence network to trace your background, ensuring the final terms addressed every single financial and physical burden you currently carry." He knew everything. The aggressive hospital collection agencies, the exhausting 14-hour shifts, the quiet, bone-deep desperation of sweeping the floors in this dusty shop just to afford instant ramen. It was an extreme, terrifying violation of my privacy, a stark display of the vast surveillance apparatus at his disposal. Yet it was executed with such surgical, fiercely protective intent that I couldn't find the necessary anger to resent him for the intrusion. He had looked at the shattered pieces of my life and decided to simply buy the entire board to fix it. "I have one absolute condition," I said, my chin lifting stubbornly as I met his unyielding gaze. I was entirely out of my depth, a street-level, underpaid appraiser aggressively negotiating with an underworld titan. But my fierce pride refused to simply bow down and accept the charity without drawing a line in the sand. "If I find a forgery hidden in your vault, I deliver the forensic evidence to you, and only to you. I will not be paraded as a witness in whatever violent underworld tribunal you convene. I do the science. I document the truth of the stones. You handle the bloody consequences." Dante's gaze darkened with a flash of profound, vibrating approval. He loved that I understood the boundaries of the game. "Agreed. Your hands remain perfectly clean. You are my brilliant appraiser, Lauren, not my executioner." He reached a gloved hand back into the inner breast pocket of his pristine, bespoke jacket and produced a heavy, custom-made gold fountain pen, offering it to me handle first. The solid gold nib caught the harsh, flickering glare of my cheap desk lamp, gleaming like a tiny lethal weapon. I looked back down at the flawless contract. Then I looked past the towering sovereign, meeting Arthur's tear-filled eyes in the shadows of the workshop. The elderly mentor offered a small, trembling nod of encouragement. He knew, just as clearly as I did, that this was the only viable way out of the suffocating quicksand that was dragging us both under. We were out of options, out of time, and out of money. I took the heavy pen from Dante's gloved fingers. The metal casing was radiantly warm from his body heat, a startling, intimate detail that sent another jolt of awareness through my nervous system. I bent over the scratched, fading velvet of the display case, pressed the gold nib to the thick archival paper, and signed my name on the dotted line. The dark ink flowed smoothly, irrevocably binding my future to him. The exact moment the pen lifted from the page, the crushing existential weight of my financial ruin entirely evaporated. It was replaced instantly by the terrifying, thrilling reality of my new existence. I was no longer prey. I was under the absolute protection of the deadliest sovereign in Boston. Dante gently reached down, pulled the leather folder closed, and handed the secured documents back to Marcus Thorne, without breaking eye contact with me. "Pack up whatever specialized personal tools you require for your work, Lauren," Dante commanded softly, efficiently the front of his heavy cashmere overcoat. The absolute stoic sovereign had fully returned, his broad posture rigid with unquestionable authority. "A secured vehicle will arrive at your West End apartment tomorrow morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, to transport you to the Beacon Hill estate. Be ready." Without another word, Dante Valerius turned gracefully and walked toward the exit. Marcus Thorne instantly unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt, pulling the door open and stepping out onto the sidewalk to secure the perimeter. The freezing, bitter winter wind rushed violently back into the quiet shop, swirling the loose dust on the floorboards, but I hardly felt the biting cold. I stood frozen behind the scratched glass counter, my dark-stained fingers rising to trace the cold silver filigree of the obsidian earring he had just returned to me. Completely, irrevocably bound to the most dangerous man in Boston. The heavy glass door clicked shut, leaving Arthur and me alone in the sudden, echoing vacuum of the shop. For a long, suspended minute, neither of us spoke. The rhythmic ticking of the broken pocket watch resumed its dominance over the quiet space. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to grip the edge of the scratched glass counter, just to remain upright. The residual heat of Dante's body still lingered in the frigid air, a phantom presence that refused to dissipate. Arthur finally stepped out of the shadows, his worn orthotics shuffling across the floorboards. He looked at the empty space where the imposing men had stood, then looked at me, his weathered face pale but entirely resolute. "Lauren," Arthur began, his voice raspy from disuse and residual fear. He walked around the counter and placed a trembling, liver-spotted hand over mine. "I have survived in this city for 70 years by knowing exactly which shadows to avoid. Dante Valerius is a man who deals in blood, leverage, and power. But the way he looked at you, he didn't look at you like an asset. He looked at me like a puzzle he intends to solve," I whispered, my thumb nervously rubbing the smooth, dark surface of the obsidian earring. "Arthur, I just signed my life over to a crime syndicate. Sterling, one of his highest-ranking men, is the one I suspect of orchestrating the forgeries. If Sterling finds out Dante hired me to audit the historical vaults, he won't hesitate to eliminate me. Then it is a very good thing you now have an army standing between you and Mr. Sterling," Arthur replied practically, tapping the glass counter. "Go. Pack your loops. Gather your specialized thermal probes, your precision tweezers, your calibrators. You are no longer working on broken watches and cheap pawnshop gold. You are stepping into the major leagues, my dear. Do not let them intimidate you. Your mind is sharper than any blade they carry." I nodded, the fierce, analytical part of my brain snapping back online. I wasn't a helpless victim being dragged away to a dungeon. I was a professional, highly trained expert being escorted to a high-security laboratory. I spent the next 2 hours methodically wrapping my delicate instruments in velvet cloths, placing them securely into my battered leather satchel. My custom-made jeweler's loop, the digital calipers, the specific chemical testing acids I used to verify the molecular density of emeralds. Everything I needed to dismantle Sterling's embezzlement scheme piece by piece. When I finally locked the shop door behind me and stepped out into the freezing Boston evening, the city felt entirely different. For 3 years I had walked these gritty, poorly lit streets looking over my shoulder, terrified of muggers, terrified of debt collectors, terrified of my own looming failure. Tonight I noticed a sleek, unmarked black SUV idling halfway down the block. Its engine hummed with quiet, lethal power. The tinted windows were completely opaque, but I knew with absolute certainty that Marcus Thorne's men were inside. They weren't there to watch me. They were there to watch everyone else. I walked back to my cramped West End apartment, the biting wind tearing through my thin, olive-green sweater, but the cold couldn't touch the burning adrenaline in my veins. The transition from my dilapidated reality to Dante's world was jarring. My apartment was a tiny, drafty box that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and damp drywall. The stack of final medical notices still sat ominously on the chipped Formica kitchen counter, a physical monument to the crushing debt I had carried since my mother's passing. I walked over to the counter, picked up the thick stack of aggressive collection letters, and dropped them unceremoniously into the trash can. It was over. The suffocating anxiety that had defined my entire adult life was simply gone, erased by the stroke of a gold pen. I stood in the center of my freezing living room and let out a long, shuddering breath, the sound breaking the stale silence of the apartment. I walked into the tiny bathroom, gripping the edges of the cracked porcelain sink, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked exhausted. My skin was pale, my dark hair messy and pulled back with a cheap clip, my collarbones sharp against my frayed collar. But there, hanging from my left ear, was the dark artisan rose. It caught the harsh fluorescent light, a tiny, elegant masterpiece of silver filigree and dark stone. Dante Valerius hadn't returned it to me out of simple courtesy. He had personally fastened it to my skin to prove a point. He recognized the meticulous craftsmanship, the hundreds of hours of painstaking labor it took to carve that stone, and he was declaring to the world that my value was no longer up for debate. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my lumpy mattress, my packed leather satchel resting by the door, staring at the digital clock on my nightstand as the glowing red numbers gradually marched toward morning. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the heavy, leather-clad knuckles grazing my neck. I smelled the intoxicating blend of oud wood and aged whiskey. I saw the stormy depths that promised absolute uncompromising protection. At exactly 7:55 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand. An unknown number. I swiped the screen. Hello? Marcus Thorne's flat, tactical voice echoed through the speaker. The vehicle is idling at the curb. The perimeter is secure. You have 5 minutes. I'm coming down, I replied, grabbing my heavy coat and my leather satchel. When I pushed through the battered front doors of my apartment building, the biting winter air hit me like a physical blow. True to Marcus's word, a massive armored black SUV sat idling directly in front of the steps, dominating the narrow, trash-strewn street. The rear passenger door swung open smoothly. Marcus stood on the curb, his dark suit impeccable, his eyes scanning the surrounding rooftops and alleyways with terrifying efficiency. He didn't offer a polite smile or a welcoming greeting. He simply took my battered leather satchel from my hand with effortless grace and gestured toward the plush interior of the vehicle. I climbed inside, the heavy armored door shutting behind me with a solid, definitive thud that entirely severed me from the noise of the city. The interior of the SUV was a stark, extreme contrast to the freezing world outside. The air was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of expensive leather and the distinct masculine scent of Dante's cologne, though the sovereign himself was not in the vehicle. The seats were buttery soft, wrapping around my exhausted body like a protective cocoon. I sank into the leather, my hands resting in my lap as Marcus slid into the front passenger seat and tapped the reinforced glass partition. The driver immediately pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the morning traffic. We were heading toward Beacon Hill. We were heading toward the fortress. The drive was a masterclass in tactical evasion. The driver didn't take the direct route up the hill. He wove through a complex, unpredictable series of side streets, checking mirrors and doubling back to ensure we weren't being followed. I watched the gritty, working-class neighborhoods of the West End gradually give way to the immaculate cobblestone streets and centuries-old brick mansions of Boston's elite district. We passed the grand venue where the gala had taken place just days ago, the exact spot where my entire life had violently derailed and subsequently been rewritten. The SUV finally turned onto a private, heavily gated access road hidden behind a massive wrought iron fence. 2 armed guards in dark tactical gear immediately stepped out of a discreet security booth, heavily armed and intensely focused. Marcus lowered his window just enough to flash a specific coded badge. The guards nodded respectfully, stepping back as the massive iron gates swung open in perfect silence. Dante Valerius's private estate was not just a home. It was a highly sophisticated, impenetrable compound built into the historical architecture of Beacon Hill. The imposing stone facade of the mansion spoke of generational wealth and unyielding power, but the high-definition cameras discreetly mounted under the eaves and the reinforced, blast-proof windows revealed its true nature. It was a fortress designed to keep the violent chaos of the underworld entirely outside. The SUV pulled into a sprawling, immaculate courtyard paved with dark granite and came to a smooth halt. Marcus stepped out first, scanning the perimeter before opening my door. I stepped out onto the granite stones, the crisp winter air biting at my cheeks. The vast dimensions of the estate was intimidating, a physical manifestation of Dante's absolute control over his environment. Before I could fully process the overwhelming architecture, the heavy oak double doors of the main entrance opened, spilling warm, golden light onto the cold stones. A woman stepped out onto the portico. She was in her late 50s, wearing a pristine tailored gray dress with a white apron, her dark hair pulled back into an elegant chignon. She exuded a profound, maternal warmth that completely contradicted the lethal security parameters of the compound. "Lauren Mitchell," she called out, her voice rich with a comforting Italian accent. She walked down the steps, her kind brown eyes immediately softening as she took in my pale, exhausted face and the defensive tightness of my posture. "Welcome, I am Sophia Moretti. Mr. Valerius instructed me to ensure your absolute comfort. Come inside, child, you must be freezing." I looked at Marcus, who offered a single rigid nod of confirmation. He carried my satchel up the steps, bypassing Sophia and heading directly into the security wing of the mansion. I turned back to the maternal housekeeper, the tight, terrified knot in my chest loosening just a fraction. "Thank you, Sophia. There is no need for thanks." Sophia smiled, gently placing a warm hand on my shoulder and guiding me out of the biting cold and into the grand foyer of the estate. The interior was breathtaking, Dark mahogany paneling, soaring ceilings, and thick plush carpets that absorbed all sound. It smelled of fresh espresso, wood smoke from a massive stone fireplace, and expensive lemon oil. Mr. Valerius has prepared the East Wing suite for you. He also requested that a tray of hot ginger tea and fresh pastries be waiting in your rooms. He knows you have not been eating properly. My breath caught in my throat. Dante was a man who commanded an army of lethal enforcers, a man who ruthlessly dismantled rival empires, yet he had specifically noted my exhaustion and ordered hot tea for my arrival. It was this jarring, impossible duality that made him so terrifyingly magnetic. "Where is he?" I asked quietly, clutching my coat tighter around my body as I stepped further into the immaculate warmth of the fortress. "Dante is currently in the lower levels, dealing with a security matter regarding Mr. Sterling," Sophia answered, her tone suddenly dropping its maternal warmth, adopting a grave, serious note that reminded me exactly where I was. She didn't elaborate on what dealing with a security matter entailed, and my professional instincts warned me not to ask. "He will meet you in the historical archives at noon to begin your work. Until then, you are safe here, Lauren. Completely safe." I nodded, the word echoing in my mind. Safe. I followed Sophia up the sweeping mahogany staircase, my hand trailing along the polished banister. The nightmare of the West End was finally behind me. I was stepping into a world of immense danger, surrounded by men who operated entirely outside the law, preparing to expose a high-ranking traitor through the forensic analysis of ancient emeralds. Yet, as I touched the cold silver filigree of the obsidian earring resting against my jaw, I knew I had never been more secure. The apex predator had claimed me, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The heavy mahogany doors of the East Wing suite swung open on silent, perfectly oiled hinges, revealing a sanctuary that defied every expectation my exhausted mind had constructed. I stepped tentatively across the threshold, my worn heels sinking into a hand-woven Persian rug so thick it entirely swallowed the sound of my footsteps. The space was a breathtaking masterclass in quiet, generational wealth. Floor-to-soiling windows, draped in heavy champagne-colored silk curtains, overlooked the sprawling snow-dusted grounds of the Beacon Hill estate. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, where thick logs of cedar popped and hissed, casting a warm golden glow across the polished hardwood floors and the plush. Bespoke cashmere throws neatly arranged on the oversized leather armchairs. It was a staggering, almost painful contrast to the drafty, peeling walls of my West End apartment. I stood near the entrance, acutely aware of my frayed olive-green sweater and the lingering scent of old dust from Arthur Pendleton's shop clinging to my clothes. I had spent years in survival mode, drowning in a relentless tide of medical debt, fighting eviction notices one unwashed dish at a time, constantly looking over my shoulder for the next disaster. The transition into this level of absolute, impenetrable security was so abrupt, it left me physically dizzy. Sophia Moretti closed the doors behind us, shutting out the cavernous silence of the mansion's grand hallways. The maternal housekeeper did not rush me. She stood a few paces away, her hands clasped neatly over her pristine white apron, allowing my overwhelmed senses to process the monumental scope of my new reality. The air in the room was infused with the sharp, comforting aroma of steeped ginger and sweet honey, emanating from a gleaming silver tea service, resting on a low mahogany table. "Please, Lauren," the older woman urged softly, her comforting Italian accent wrapping around the syllables of my name. "Sit by the fire. The cold of this city has a way of settling deep into the marrow if you do not fight it." I moved stiffly, the residual adrenaline from the morning's extraction still humming through my nervous system. I carefully placed my battered leather satchel on the floor, terrified of scratching the immaculate furniture, before sinking into the deep leather armchair. The radiant heat from the hearth washed over my shivering frame, instantly beginning to thaw the tense, frozen knots in my shoulders. Sophia poured a cup of the steaming ginger tea, the delicate porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. As she handed it to me, her warm, steady fingers brushed against mine. She paused, her kind brown eyes, framed by the elegant chignon of her dark hair, dropped to examine my hands. She saw the dark, stubborn stains of silver polish, embedded in my cuticles, the tiny, healing burn marks from the microtorch, and the short, utilitarian nails required for precision jewelry restoration. The housekeeper's gaze then lifted, tracing the line of my jaw, until she focused on my intricate volcanic glass, earring with its delicate silver filigree resting against my skin. The metal caught the firelight, a stark testament to the grueling labor I had poured into its creation, and the very beacon that had led the apex predator of Boston directly to my door. Mr. Valerius is a man composed entirely of calculated risks, the housekeeper murmured, her tone shifting from polite hospitality to a profound, evaluating sincerity. She took a step back, her posture radiating a quiet grace that spoke of decades spent surviving in the shadow of a criminal empire. He does not bring outsiders into this fortress. The women who occasionally circle his periphery are drawn to the power, the violence, the superficial gold. They possess soft, unblemished hands and empty, grasping ambitions. I swallowed a mouthful of the hot, spicy tea, the liquid burning pleasantly down my dry throat. I'm not here for his money, Sophia. I'm here to do a job. An employment contract was signed. I know, she replied smoothly, a faint, approving smile touching the corners of her mouth. You have the hands of an artisan, a creator who understands the brutal pressure required to forge something lasting. You did not come here to be an ornament, child. You came here to work. That is why Dante trusts you, and that is why you belong within these walls. Her validation hit me with the unexpected force of a physical blow. For years, society had conditioned me to view my calloused hands and my obsessive dedication to my craft as a marker of low-class failure. I had hidden my intelligence behind a veil of invisibility to avoid the predatory glances of men who only wanted to exploit my desperation. Yet, in the heart of a syndicate boss's impenetrable compound, the matriarch of his household was looking at my scars as a badge of honor. I took another slow, measured sip of the tea, letting the profound relief seep into my exhausted bones. The agonizing, relentless war for survival had finally broken. I was safe. Drink your tea and eat the pastries. You have an hour to rest and refresh yourself, the older woman instructed gently, turning toward an adjoining door. But first, I believe it would ease your mind to see the environment Dante has prepared for your expertise. Bring your satchel. My professional curiosity flared, instantly overriding my physical exhaustion. I set the porcelain cup down, grabbed my heavy leather bag, and followed her through the doorway. We bypassed the lavish ensuite bathroom and entered a secondary room that had been completely structurally modified. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just a workspace. It was a state-of-the-art, high-security gemological laboratory. The walls were painted a flat, non-reflective matte gray to prevent any color distortion during stone evaluation. A massive, custom-built steel and oak workbench dominated the center of the room, illuminated by overhead, daylight-calibrated fiber optic lights that eliminated every single shadow. My eyes darted across the equipment, my mind reeling at the sheer, astronomical financial investment sitting on the counters. There was a brand new Zeiss stereo microscope, with high-definition digital imaging capabilities, a digital refractometer designed to measure the exact speed of light, bending through a facet, an advanced dichromatic color filter set, and a row of specialized specific gravity liquids sealed in pristine glass vials. He ordered this? I whispered, walking slowly toward the workbench and running my fingertips over the cool, flawless steel surface. It was a staggering upgrade from the wobbly splintering desk I had used at Arthur's shop. He demanded the finest technology available on the global market, Sophia confirmed, watching my awestruck reaction with deep satisfaction. The installation crew worked through the night to ensure it was perfectly calibrated before your arrival. He explicitly stated that your intellect was not to be hindered by inadequate tools. I set my battered leather satchel onto the pristine bench, my hands trembling slightly as I unbuckled the straps. I carefully unpacked my personal worn instruments, my brass jeweler's loop, my digital calipers, my precision tweezers. I laid them out on the velvet mat provided. The contrast between my cheap, well-used tools and the multi-billion-dollar laboratory was glaring, but it was also profoundly empowering. Dante Valerius hadn't just paid off my debts to buy my submission. He had built me a throne from which I could wage his war. He was arming me with the best weaponry money could buy, and my weapon was the truth. I will leave you to prepare, the housekeeper said softly, stepping backward out of the laboratory. Dante expects you in the lower archives at exactly noon. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the brilliantly lit, silent room. I stood before the microscope, the heavy, chaotic anxiety of the past 3 days entirely evaporating. I had relied on fading into the woodwork precisely to avoid this level of attention, hiding from a world that only saw my poverty. But here, surrounded by microscopic lenses and precision steel, I was no longer an invisible girl. I was the personal archive gemologist for the most dangerous syndicate in Boston, and I was about to dismantle a traitor's empire one flaw at a time. At exactly 5 minutes to noon, a sharp, rhythmic knock echoed against the heavy mahogany door of my suite. I had washed the grime of the city from my skin, changed into a clean, simple black turtleneck and tailored trousers provided in the massive walk-in closet, and gathered my primary analytical tools into a customized leather belt pouch. I opened the door to find Marcus Thorne standing in the hallway, his tactical suit immaculate, his expression carved from unyielding stone. "It is time, Miss Mitchell," the enforcer stated, a low, gravelly rasp that demanded absolute compliance. I followed the dark-suited man through the winding, silent corridors of the Beacon Hill estate, navigating a labyrinth of extreme luxury that slowly transitioned into brutal utilitarian security. We reached a discreet reinforced steel elevator hidden behind a false panel in the sprawling library. Marcus bypassed the standard buttons entirely, pressing his thumb against a biometric scanner before leaning forward to allow a red laser to sweep across his retina. The heavy doors slid open with a pressurized hiss, revealing a sterile stainless steel cabin. The descent was smooth but unnervingly long, taking us deep beneath the bedrock of the historic city, the sudden change in air pressure popping in my ears as we descended. When the doors finally parted, a draft of chilled, sterile air swept over me, smelling of dry concrete, oiled steel, and ancient, decaying paper. We stepped into the high-security subterranean vault. The sheer scale of the underground facility was breathtaking. It was a massive, climate-controlled bunker lined with reinforced concrete and illuminated by harsh industrial LED lighting. Rows upon rows of heavy, fireproof titanium safes and climate-sealed glass display cases stretched into the distance. It was a staggering repository of illicit wealth, centuries of stolen antiquities, untraceable bearer bonds, blood-soaked ledgers, historical artifacts that museums across the globe would kill to possess. Standing in the center of the vast space, examining a heavy leather-bound ledger on a stainless steel table, was the sovereign himself. Dante wore a flawlessly tailored, three-piece suit in a shade of deep, midnight navy that made his broad shoulders look impossibly wide. He had discarded the heavy cashmere overcoat, revealing the lean, predatory lines of his torso. As my footsteps echoed softly on the polished concrete floor, he closed the ledger and turned to face me. His slate irises, cold, ancient, and calculating, swept over my new attire, lingering for a split moment on the hand-carved obsidian earring hanging from my left lobe. A subtle, dangerous shift occurred in his expression, a quiet acknowledgement of his absolute claim over my presence. "Punctual, Lauren," the syndicate boss murmured, his resonant baritone vibrating through the cavernous vault. He dismissed Marcus with a single, minimal flick of his wrist. The enforcer retreated to the elevator, the steel doors sealing shut and leaving us entirely alone in the underground fortress. "I trust Sophia ensured your quarters were adequate?" "They are more than adequate, Mr. Valerius," I replied, maintaining a professional distance as I approached the steel table. "The laboratory you built is extraordinary. It possesses diagnostic capabilities that rival federal forensic facilities. You are dealing with high-level deception, Lauren. I will not have your brilliant mind handicapped by inferior tools," Dante stated smoothly, closing the physical distance between us until the intoxicating scent of aged whiskey and oud wood completely masked the metallic ozone of the vault. He gestured toward a secondary table positioned beneath a focused, high-intensity halogen lamp. Resting on the cold steel was a long, shallow tray lined with black velvet. "Julian Sterling, my chief financial officer, has managed the syndicate's alternative asset portfolio for 6 years," Dante explained, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. 3 months ago, he authorized the acquisition of a specific, highly coveted historical piece to launder a significant sum of capital. He assured the council that the asset was flawless. "I want you to tell me the truth." I stepped up to the table and looked down at the velvet tray. Nestled carefully in the center was a breathtaking, massive forged Byzantine emerald necklace. The heavy gold links were intricately pierced and woven, supporting 7 enormous, deep green stones that seemed to absorb the harsh lighting of the vault. "A Byzantine collar," I whispered, my professional instincts instantly engaging. I pulled the brass jeweler's loop from my pouch and leaned over the tray, adjusting the angle of the halogen lamp, purportedly from the early 6th century. "If this is genuine, the provenance and the sheer carat weight of these emeralds make it a multi-million-dollar acquisition." Is it genuine? Dante asked, his towering frame stepping up directly behind me. The radiating heat of his body was a solid protective wall against my back, triggering a sudden, electric spike in my pulse. I forced my breathing to remain steady, entirely focusing my analytical mind on the metal and stone before me. I slipped on a pair of white cotton inspection gloves, carefully lifting the heavy necklace from the velvet. I raised the central emerald to my loupe, clicking on a specialized, high-intensity fiber optic pen light to illuminate the internal structure of the gem. The untrained eye would see a beautifully preserved, ancient artifact. The gold exhibited the classic opus interrazzle piercing techniques characteristic of the Byzantine era, and the emeralds were a stunning, saturated vivid green. But I didn't look at the superficial beauty. I looked for the violent, chaotic history of natural creation. I looked for the microscopic scars left by the earth. The gold setting is likely authentic, or at least cannibalized from a lesser historical artifact, to pass initial carbon dating and metallurgical assays. I narrated softly, the technical details anchoring my racing heart. But the true value lies in the stones. Natural emeralds, especially ancient ones, sourced from the legendary Habaktal mines or early Egyptian deposits, contain what gemologists call a jardin, a microscopic garden of imperfections. We look for three-phase inclusions: jagged, irregular microscopic cavities containing a liquid, a bubble of gas, and a solid crystal. I slowly rotated the massive center stone under the intense magnification, my brow furrowing in deep concentration. I checked the facet junctions, the pavilion, the table of the gem. These stones have no jardine. They are entirely devoid of natural, irregular inclusions. I set the necklace down and pulled a small specialized dichromatic color filter from my pouch, holding it to my eye as I shone the bright white light directly through the gems. Under the specialized filter, the deep green color vanished entirely, replaced by an intense, unnatural, glowing, neon red. It's a modern fabrication, I concluded, a cold, sinking feeling of dread settling in my stomach as the massive extent of the impending fallout became apparent. These are hydrothermal synthetic emeralds, lab-grown. The intense red reaction under the dichromatic filter indicates a massive concentration of chromium with absolutely no iron content, which is virtually impossible for stones allegedly mined in the ancient world. Furthermore, under magnification, I can see distinct chevron-shaped growth, striae, and microscopic nail-head spicules. I placed the necklace back onto the velvet tray, stripping off the cotton gloves, as I looked up to meet Dante's intense gaze. The chevron growth pattern is the absolute signature of a modern hydrothermal synthesis process. They were baked in a pressurized platinum crucible in a laboratory, likely no more than a year ago. Mr. Valerius, this piece is a fabricated lie. Julian Sterling purchased a gutted, low-value antique gold chain, filled it with lab-created synthetics worth perhaps a few $1,000s, and presented it as a priceless historical artifact. He likely pocketed the multi-million-dollar difference. It is absolute, undeniable embezzlement. Silence stretched through the subterranean vault, thick and suffocating. I had just handed the sovereign leader of the city's underworld the forensic proof required to execute one of his highest-ranking officers. My hands trembled slightly as I dropped the loop back into my pouch, suddenly acutely aware of the extreme lethal danger I had just inserted myself into. Dante did not explode into a violent rage. He did not shout or flip the heavy steel table. His reaction was far more terrifying. The man went utterly, chillingly still. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to physically drop, his storm-gray eyes darkening into bottomless pools of pure obsidian. The faint silver scar on his brow tightened as his jaw locked, the sheer magnitude of his betrayal processing behind his stoic mask. He was a predator calculating the exact devastating trajectory of his revenge. Then slowly, his gaze shifted from the forged Byzantine emerald necklace to my pale, exhausted face. The terrifying, cold fury in his eyes instantly thawed, replaced by a profound burning wave of protective warmth that physically staggered me. He reached out, his large, bare hand resting flat on the stainless steel table, mere inches from my trembling fingers. The heat radiating from his skin was a stark contrast to the freezing metal. "You are shaking, Lauren," Dante observed quietly, his resonant baritone dropping to a terrifyingly intimate whisper. "I just handed you the motive for a mafia assassination," I replied, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the massive vault. "Julian Sterling is a powerful man in your organization. When he discovers that a street-level appraiser exposed his multi-million-dollar fraud, he won't target you. He will target me. He will never get the chance, Dante vowed, the words carrying the heavy, uncompromising weight of an absolute blood oath. He shifted his stance, his towering frame completely blocking my view of the heavy steel doors, turning himself into a physical, impenetrable shield between me and the violent world above. Sterling has operated under the assumption that he is the smartest predator in the room. He relied on the ignorance of wealthy men to mask his greed. He did not anticipate that I would bring a master artisan into my fortress. Dante leaned slightly closer, the proximity forcing me to tilt my head back, just to maintain eye contact. The unspoken tension between us was a living, breathing entity, crackling with a fierce magnetic energy that made my lungs burn. "You have done exactly what I hired you to do," the sovereign murmured, his thumb lightly grazing the edge of the table near my hand. A subtle, highly controlled gesture that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my chest. "You have read this history of the stones and the metals. You have provided the truth. Now you will step back, return to the absolute safety of your laboratory, and leave the bloody consequences entirely to me." He was keeping the promise he had made in the dusty West End shop. He wasn't dragging me into the crossfire. He was utilizing my supreme professional competence to orchestrate his empire, while ensuring my hands remained perfectly clean. It was a staggering display of sovereign justice, completely divorced from the corrupt, failing legal systems that had ignored my struggles for years. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice barely a breath. Dante Valerius looked down at the velvet tray, holding the forged emerald necklace, a dark, ruthless smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "I am going to arrange a public auction, Lauren, and Julian Sterling is going to pay the ultimate price for his forgery." The next 48 hours dissolved into a hyper-focused blur of relentless, clinical analysis inside the fortified sanctuary of my new laboratory. The staggering revelation regarding the forged Byzantine emeralds had merely scratched the surface of a much darker, systemic corruption. Valerius had immediately granted me unrestricted access to the deepest tiers of his subterranean archives, tasking me with auditing the absolute foundational wealth of his syndicate. The responsibility was crushing, a heavy, suffocating mantle that settled onto my shoulders, but the sheer, unprecedented access to these historical artifacts fed my analytical mind like oxygen. I sat perfectly still on the ergonomic leather stool, the ambient temperature of the matte gray room maintained at a precise 68 degrees to prevent any thermal expansion in the highly sensitive testing equipment. The harsh, daylight-calibrated fiber optic overheads eliminated every single shadow across the custom-built steel workbench, creating a surgical environment of absolute truth. Every surface in the laboratory was immaculate, smelling faintly of ozone and specialized cleaning solvents, a world away from the dusty, chaotic warmth of Arthur Pendleton's restoration shop. Here, beneath Beacon Hill, I was entirely isolated from the rest of the estate, sealed behind inches of reinforced steel and biometric security locks. Yet, for the first time in my life, the isolation did not feel like a cage. It felt like a fortress designed explicitly to protect my mind. Sophia Moretti had quietly brought me a tray of hot chamomile tea and artisanal biscotti hours ago, her warm maternal smile a stark contrast to the cold, analytical reality of my current task. She had even draped a soft cashmere throw over the back of my chair, a silent, tactile reminder that I was no longer fighting the winter chill in my drafty, debt-ridden apartment. The porcelain cup now sat forgotten at the edge of the desk, the liquid inside completely cold, a thin film settling over the surface, while I stared down at the terrifying evidence mounting before my eyes. Spread out before me on a series of velvet-lined appraisal trays was a legendary collection of ancient imperial coins. They were primarily ore from the First Imperial Dynasty, solid gold pieces that bore the severe, stamped profiles of emperors long dead. According to the syndicate's heavily encrypted, leather-bound ledger resting near my elbow, this specific collection was the financial bedrock of the organization's alternative assets. It was a pristine, untraceable reserve, worth tens of millions of dollars on the illicit antiquities market, curated to withstand global economic collapse, completely untethered from the fluctuating vulnerabilities of modern fiat currency. They were supposed to be flawless, untouchable monuments to eternal wealth. The sort of wealth that bought armies, judges, and absolute silence. I picked up a heavy gold aureus bearing the stamped profile of an infamous emperor, gripping the edges delicately with my precision titanium tweezers. The cold metal transferred a faint chill through the thin latex of my inspection gloves, contrasting with the nervous sweat dampening my palms. The sheer historical gravity of the object should have felt awe-inspiring. Instead, a creeping sense of unease was already working its way up my spine. I raised the coin to the lens of the high-powered stereo microscope, adjusting the focal dial with my free hand until the ancient, irregular surface of the gold swam into terrifyingly sharp relief. I had always loved the brutal honesty of ancient currency. I had spent nearly a decade hunched over a battered, scratched wooden desk at Arthur Pendleton's dusty West End shop, carefully learning the microscopic topography of true antiquity. Arthur had taught me to read the violence of a hand-struck coin. In antiquity, gold coins of the Roman Empire were struck entirely by hand. A blank disc of precious metal, known as a planchet, was heated in a forge and placed between two heavy, hand-engraved iron dies before being struck violently with a massive hammer by a highly skilled mint worker. Because of this crude manual process, no two genuine coins were ever exactly identical. The strike was always slightly off-center, the details uniquely compressed, and the edges irregular and organically cracked from the sudden, massive dispersal of kinetic energy. The metal held the microscopic history of human imperfection and ancient violence. But as I slowly rotated the aureus under the intense magnification, my trained eyes snagged on a catastrophic anomaly. It was microscopic, nearly invisible to anyone lacking that obsessive, poverty-driven training I had endured at Arthur's side. Running along the extreme outer perimeter of the coin's edge, partially obscured by a layer of artificially applied, chemical patination dirt designed to mimic centuries of burial in rich soil, was a continuous, mathematically perfect line. The microscopic flaw screamed like a siren in a silent room. My breath hitched sharply, a cold, hard knot of dread crystallizing in the pit of my stomach. My throat constricted, the sterile air of the lab turning heavy and dry, as my lungs struggled to adapt to the sudden shift in momentum. I quickly swapped the first coin for an aureus bearing the profile of the first emperor. I placed it under the lens, adjusting the fiber-optic penlight to cast a raking glare across the rim. The same microscopic seam. I grabbed a third, a rare piece from the reign of the second emperor, the rushing sound of my own pulse deafening in my ears. The seam was there, perfectly uniform, encircling the edge like a microscopic equator. I pushed away from the microscope, the wheels of my stool squeaking sharply against the polished concrete floor. The frantic staccato rhythm of my heart hammered violently against my ribs. They weren't hammered, they were cast. More specifically, they were high-level electrotypes. The devastating realization spread through my mind like blood seeping through gauze, staining every single assumption I had made about the structural security of Dante Valerius's empire. The forgery process I was examining was diabolically sophisticated, requiring a state-of-the-art metallurgical laboratory. A criminal artisan had taken genuine, priceless ancient coins and pressed into soft silicone to create perfect negative molds. They then used a chemical electrolytic bath to deposit a microscopic shell of gold into the molds, creating two separate, highly detailed hollow halves, an obverse and a reverse. These halves were then filled with a dense base metal core, likely a custom tungsten alloy designed to mimic the exact specific gravity of solid gold, and seamlessly fused together. The microscopic line I was seeing under the precision optical lens was the joining seam, meticulously filed down and disguised with fake archaeological debris to fool casual inspections. I frantically turned to the digital hydrostatic balance, resting on the far side of the steel bench. I needed absolute, undeniable chemical proof before I leveled an accusation of this magnitude. I carefully calibrated the hypersensitive scale, weighing the first aureus in the open air of the laboratory, and then suspended it in a beaker of room-temperature distilled water. The machine whirred softly, calculating the specific gravity of the object based on precise fluid displacement. Pure 24-karat ancient gold possesses a specific gravity of 19.32. Anything less was an immediate, undeniable red flag. The digital readout flashed in stark red numbers, 18.85. It was a fabricated lie. The entire collection was a lie. I didn't stop. For the next 3 agonizing hours, I subjected the entire velvet tray of 50 coins to a relentless battery of forensic tests. I utilized the X-ray fluorescent spectrometer, bombarding the surface of the fakes with high-energy radiation to read their exact metallurgical composition down to the molecular level. The graphs on the adjacent computer monitor spiked violently in all the wrong places, revealing trace amounts of modern refined copper and zinc that absolutely did not exist in ancient metallurgy. Julian Sterling had not just embezzled a single multi-million-dollar Byzantine necklace. That isolated fraud we discovered 2 days ago was merely a symptom of a terminal, systemic cancer. The trusted chief financial officer had methodically, quietly, over the course of years, gutted the foundational wealth of the Valerius syndicate. He had secretly sold off the genuine historical artifacts to private, untraceable buyers on the black market, replacing them in Dante's subterranean vault with these flawless, lab-created clones. The financial devastation was incalculable. Sterling had effectively hollowed out the apex predator's empire from the inside out, leaving behind a glittering, worthless shell meant to pass superficial audits and blind the men who trusted him. I stood in the center of the laboratory, my hands shaking so violently, I had to press my palms flat against the cold steel of the workbench just to remain upright. I had spent my life perfecting the art of being invisible precisely to avoid this level of lethal danger. I was a street-level appraiser who had struggled to pay a basic electricity bill less than a week ago, and now I was holding the forensic equivalent of a live, unpinned grenade that would detonate the hierarchy of the most dangerous criminal organization in the Northeast. I reached for the secure, encrypted intercom panel mounted on the matte gray wall. My fingers, their tips dark-stained from hours of handling harsh polishing compounds and nitric acid residue from my meticulous testing, hovered over the heavy steel button for a long, agonizing moment. Pressing this button meant initiating a war. It meant unleashing a level of violence that I had spent my entire life desperately running from. But as I felt the cold, familiar weight of the unique handcrafted obsidian earring, with its delicate silver filigree resting against my left jawline, my resolve hardened. Dante Valerius had not brought me here to cower. He had brought me here to be his absolute, uncompromising weapon of truth. He had trusted my mind when the rest of the world saw only my poverty. I pressed the button. "I need to speak with Mr. Valerius," I said, my voice remarkably steady, despite the chaotic adrenaline flooding my nervous system. Immediately. Less than 10 minutes later, the heavy reinforced door of the laboratory slid open with a pressurized hiss. I caught a brief glimpse of Marcus Thorne standing stoically in the corridor, securing the perimeter with absolute professional vigilance, before the heavy steel door snapped shut again, sealing me inside with the dawn. Dante stepped over the threshold, bringing the heavy, intoxicating atmosphere of the estate with him. He had stripped off his suit jacket and tie, wearing only a crisp white bespoke dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the corded, powerful muscles and the edge of a dark, intricate tattoo wrapping around his left wrist. The sheer physical reality of his presence was overwhelming. The rich scent of aged, single malt whiskey and sharp petrichor instantly chased away the sterile, metallic odor of the testing chemicals. He moved with that terrifying, predatory grace, closing the distance between us until the ambient temperature of the room seemed to violently spike. "You requested my presence, Lauren," the sovereign murmured, his tempestuous gaze immediately scanning my pale face before dropping to examine my posture, searching for any signs of physical distress. His brow furrowed, the faint, silver scar interrupting his eyebrow tightening with instant, protective concern. "Has something happened in the lab? Are you unwell?" "I'm perfectly fine," I managed to say, though my chest felt incredibly tight with the unspoken tension that always flared the moment he entered my proximity. I took a slow, deep breath and gestured toward the velvet-lined trays resting under the harsh halogen lights. "But your archive is not." Dante's gaze shifted to the display of ancient gold. The protective warmth in his eyes instantly cooled into a sharp, analytical focus. He stepped up beside me, standing so close that the radiating heat of his large frame was a solid, comforting wall against my side, shielding me from the chill of the room. "The early imperial ore," Dante stated quietly, his resonant baritone vibrating in the quiet space. "The absolute cornerstone of our alternative physical reserves. Julian Sterling acquired the final pieces of this collection over 4 years ago." "I assume your analysis has found a discrepancy?" "I found a massacre, Dante," I corrected, the formal barriers entirely obliterated by the sheer scale of the crisis. His expression, previously cast in sharp professional lines, immediately softened at the sound of his first name on my tongue. The lethal edge vanished from his jaw, and I watched his storm-gray gaze drop with a slow, deliberate focus to my lips for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes, completely welcoming the sudden intimacy. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to turn away from the magnetic pull of his gaze. I picked up my digital tablet, pulling up the high-definition microphotographs I had taken through the optical lens, and handed it to him. Ancient coins were struck by hand with a heavy hammer. The edges should be irregular, cracked, and organic. Observe the extreme outer perimeter of the coin on the screen. The syndicate boss stared at the magnified image, his dark, calculating eyes locking onto the flawless, continuous line running along the edge of the gold. A seam. Exactly. It's a manufacturing seam, I explained, shifting smoothly into my professional cadence, using the technical details to anchor my spiraling anxiety. These are not hammered coins, they are electrotypes. Someone made perfect silicone molds of the genuine artifacts, used an electrolytic bath to deposit a microscopic shell of gold, and then filled the hollow center with a dense tungsten alloy to fake the weight. I ran them through the hydrostatic balance. The specific gravity is 18. 85, not the 19. 32 required of pure ancient gold. I then subjected them to the X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. I tapped the screen, swiping to the volatile metallurgical graphs that mapped the chemical composition of the objects. They contain modern refined zinc and copper trace elements. It is chemically impossible for these to be ancient. Dante remained perfectly still, the tablet gripped lightly in his large, scarred hand. He did not speak. It's not just one coin, I continued, my voice dropping to a near whisper as the crushing weight of the revelation settled between us. I tested 50 pieces from the trays. Every single one of them is a highly sophisticated, lab-created clone. The forged Byzantine emerald necklace we examined was merely a symptom. This is a systemic infection. Julian Sterling hasn't just been skimming off the top of recent acquisitions. He has been methodically, quietly replacing the foundational wealth of your entire syndicate with worthless fakes for years. He has hollowed out your empire from the inside. The silence that followed my declaration was the most terrifying sound I had ever experienced. It was heavy, pressurized, carrying the distinct, suffocating weight of an impending detonation. Dante Valerius did not explode. He did not shout or throw the expensive tablet against the concrete wall or exhibit any of the chaotic, volatile violence typical of underworld enforcers. His reaction was an implosion, a quiet, devastating collapse of the surrounding atmosphere into a singularity of absolute, localized terror. The man went chillingly, unnaturally rigid. The air in the laboratory seemed to instantly freeze, the oxygen evaporating under the sheer, crushing pressure of his silent rage. His storm-gray eyes darkened into a pitch-black abyss, completely devoid of light or mercy. I could actually see the lethal calculations executing behind his stoic mask. The realization that his most trusted financial officer, a man who had sat at his table and managed his ledgers, had orchestrated a monumental, years-long treason meant to leave the organization financially crippled and defenseless. The muscles in Dante's forearms corded with extreme, violent tension. His heavy knuckles turned bone white as he slowly, deliberately placed the digital tablet down onto the steel workbench. The faint clatter of the device hitting the metal sounded like a gunshot. I involuntarily took a half-step backward, my survival instincts screaming at me to flee from the apex predator, whose territory had just been catastrophically breached. I had spent my life terrified of angry men who used their physical power to punish the innocent, bracing myself whenever a shadow shifted too quickly. I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing for the inevitable explosive fallout that always accompanied male anger in my past. But the violence never came. Instead, a large, impossibly warm hand gently wrapped around my cold, damp wrist. I gasped, my eyes flying open. Dante had closed the distance between us. The terrifying, lethal monster that had just possessed his features was strictly contained, forcibly shoved down and locked away behind a wall of sheer, unparalleled willpower. He refused to let his rage touch me. He refused to let the toxic fallout of his empire taint the sanctuary he had built for me. For years, I had successfully mastered the craft of blending into the background. But sitting directly in the sovereign's gaze, I no longer wanted to hide. "Focus on me, Lauren," Dante commanded softly. His voice was a low, soothing rumble that bypassed my panic and resonated directly in my chest. I gazed up, my breath catching as I met his gaze. The obsidian darkness had receded, replaced entirely by that profound, burning wave of protective warmth. His thumb began a slow, rhythmic stroke against the pulse point of my wrist, a deliberate, tactile grounding technique that instantly began to pull me back from the edge of my panic. The stark contrast between the absolute violence he was capable of unleashing upon the world and the immense gentleness he was currently weaponizing to keep me calm was staggering. "You are entirely safe," the sovereign vowed, his words carrying the heavy, unyielding weight of absolute truth. "My anger is not directed at you. It will never be directed at you. Do you understand?" I nodded slowly, the frantic hammering of my heart beginning to ease under the hypnotic rhythm of his thumb. "He stole tens of millions from you, Dante. He compromised the syndicate's core reserves. He signed his own death warrant," Dante corrected, his tone flat and devoid of any emotion other than absolute certainty. Julian Sterling believed he could blind me with loyalty. He believed the structural integrity of his lies would outlast my vigilance. But he made one fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. Dante took a half-step closer, entirely invading my personal space. The scent of him, so powerful, so distinctly masculine, wrapped around my senses, completely overriding my lingering fear. He raised his free hand, his knuckles gently grazing the line of my jaw, stopping just shy of the artisan obsidian earring resting there. It was an intensely intimate gesture, thick with an unspoken magnetic tension that made my skin burn, and my lungs forget how to process air. "He did not anticipate you," Dante whispered, his eyes dropping briefly to my lips before rising to meet my gaze with a fierce, possessive pride. "He did not know that I possessed a master artisan, capable of reading the microscopic scars of history. You did not just uncover a fraud today, Lauren. You saved the foundation of my empire. You saw the poison hidden within the gold." The validation washed over me, a profound, healing balm to the years of invisibility and disrespect I had endured from a society that only valued superficial wealth. I was not a victim here. I was the architect of his salvation, my brilliant mind recognized and revered by a man who bowed to no one. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely a breath, entirely lost in the gravitational pull of his presence. Dante's jaw tightened, the faint silver scar on his brow pulling taut, as the lethal sovereign re-emerged, perfectly balanced alongside the protective guardian. "Now, I finalize the arrangements for the public auction. We will let Julian Sterling stand in front of the entire underworld and bid on his own forged assets. And when the hammer falls, I will dismantle his life with the exact, ruthless precision you just applied to these coins." He slowly released my wrist, though the phantom heat of his touch remained seared into my skin. "Lock the laboratory, Lauren. Your work for the day is complete. The rest of this war belongs to me." The residual adrenaline from the subterranean vault refused to dissipate, leaving my nervous system vibrating with a high frequency, exhausting energy that made sleep a physical impossibility. I had retreated to the absolute luxury of my assigned guest suite, pacing the thick, hand-woven Persian rugs for hours. But the quiet solitude only amplified the chaotic, terrifying reality of the forensic evidence I had just uncovered. The suite itself was a masterpiece of secure opulence. Heavy mahogany furniture polished to a mirror shine, silk drapes drawn tightly over reinforced bulletproof glass, and a massive bed layered in bespoke cashmere that I couldn't bring myself to touch. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the microscopic growth structures of that hydrothermal synthetic emerald projected against the back of my eyelids. My mind raced through the optical properties, the refractive index readings that proved the devastating deception. Real Colombian emeralds formed over millions of years, trapping jagged, three-phase inclusions within their barrel structure. But the stone in Dante's vault had contained microscopic chevron-shaped growth lines, the undeniable clinical signature of a gem rapidly grown in a pressurized, superheated autoclave. It was a massive, systemic fraud perpetrated from within the highest ranks of Dante's empire, and I was the one who had just handed the executioner the blade. I was a gemologist, a scientist who relied on empirical data, hydrostatic scales, and quiet observation, yet I was now inextricably tangled in a world governed by blood, leverage, and lethal loyalty. What did it mean to be the one holding the scalpel that would excise the rot from a criminal empire? My hands, calloused from years of stringing pearls and polishing antique clasps in Arthur's dusty back room, were now holding the leverage that could end a man's life. Julian Sterling had sat at the right hand of Dante, balancing the ledgers of an organization that moved bastions in untraceable assets, and he had thought himself untouchable. He hadn't counted on a desperate, meticulous woman with a 40-power magnification loop and a stubborn refusal to be intimidated by gold. Yet the sheer scale of the financial devastation terrified me. The silence of the penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like the heavy pressurized calm before a catastrophic detonation. At 2 in the morning, driven by a restless need for a different kind of silence, I quietly slipped out of my room and navigated the dimly lit, cavernous corridors of the Beacon Hill estate. Back in my West End apartment, the night was always filled with the wail of sirens, the rattling of poorly sealed windows against the bitter wind, and the suffocating anxiety of looming debt that pressed down on my chest the moment the lights went out. Here, the air was climate-controlled, perfectly still, smelling faintly of expensive floor wax, ancient cedar wood, and quiet authority. The sheer contrast between my old life, a life of running, of scraping together pennies just to keep the heat on, and this absolute fortress was dizzying. I found myself drawn to the massive 2-story library Sophia had pointed out earlier in the day when she gave me a tour of the safe zones. The heavy oak doors were ajar, spilling a warm, amber sliver of light onto the polished hardwood floor of the hallway. I pushed the door open, the perfectly oiled hinges absolutely silent, and stepped into a breathtaking sanctuary of leather-bound history and hushed power. Floor-to-soiling mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, accessible by ornate wrought iron spiral staircases, holding thousands of ancient volumes that smelled faintly of vanilla, aging paper, and dust. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far end of the room, where a dying fire cast flickering, golden shadows across the plush velvet armchairs and heavy drapery. It was a room built for contemplation, for the heavy, quiet decisions made by men who ruled from the shadows. Dante Valerius was sitting in the deepest armchair near the hearth, cloaked in the shadows, his presence a sudden, gravitational pull that instantly anchored my frantic thoughts. He had discarded the formal, bespoke white dress shirt from the laboratory, now wearing a thick, dark charcoal cashmere sweater that molded to the broad, powerful lines of his shoulders and chest. In the dim light, the lethal, untouchable sovereign of Boston's underworld was momentarily softened, replaced by a quiet, solitary man bearing the immense, invisible weight of a global empire. A heavy crystal decanter of vintage whiskey sat on a low mahogany table beside him, alongside a single half-empty tumbler that caught the firelight with a warm, fractured glow. He did not look surprised to see me standing in the doorway. He simply reached out with his large, scarred hand, took a second crystal glass from a silver tray, and poured a generous measure of the dark liquor. The clink of crystal against crystal was the only sound in the vast room. The silence of this house can be deafening when your mind is accustomed to the noise of survival, Dante murmured, his resonant baritone vibrating smoothly through the quiet library. Come sit, Lauren. I moved across the room, my footsteps entirely absorbed by the thick carpet, the sheer contrast between this opulent sanctuary and my drafty West End apartment striking me with a fresh wave of surrealism. I sank into the velvet armchair opposite him, pulling my legs up slightly, seeking a comforting physical boundary in the overwhelming space. I accepted the heavy crystal tumbler he offered. Our fingers brushed for a mere heartbeat against the cold glass. The brief electric contact sent a sudden, searing jolt of heat racing up my arm, a stark reminder of the lethal power humming just beneath his calm exterior. I brought the glass to my lips, the vintage whiskey burning a slow, spicy trail down my throat, grounding my scattered senses with its rich, smoky complexity. I have spent the last 3 years functioning on 4 hours of sleep a night, terrified of every knock at my door and every piece of mail in my mailbox, I confessed quietly, staring down into the amber liquid. I traced the intricate cut-glass pattern with my thumb, feeling the sharp edges of the crystal. My brain doesn't know how to power down. It is still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the eviction notice to be taped to my door in bright yellow paper, for the hospital billing department to finally drag me into court and garnish whatever pathetic wages I managed to scrape together from Arthur's shop, finding a multi-million-dollar forgery in your private collection. It just feels like another form of impending ruin. A higher altitude of the exact same freefall. The silence in the library was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and tasted of old paper, sharp whiskey, and the lingering ghosts of my exhaustion. It was the physical manifestation of all the unspoken tension that had hummed between us since the night of the gala. Dante watched me with a profound, unwavering intensity, his clouded eyes measuring the raw, vulnerable admission without a shred of pity. He understood the fundamental mechanics of fear. He did not offer empty platitudes or generic comfort. He offered absolute, uncompromising reality. Your mother's illness, he stated softly, not as a question, but as a deeply researched fact he had committed to memory. The oncology treatments at Boston General. You drained your savings, sold your own assets, and assumed a crushing volume of predatory debt to afford her a few more months of comfort. You fought a war you were statistically guaranteed to lose, simply because you refused to let her fight it alone. My breath hitched painfully in my chest, a sudden, hot sting of unshed tears pricking the corners of my eyes. I had never spoken about the suffocating reality of that time to anyone, not even Arthur. My mentor had given me a job when I was desperate, allowing me to repair antique clasps and string pearls in the back room. But he hadn't known the sheer scale of the financial devastation threatening to swallow me whole. He didn't know about the collection agencies calling at all hours, the threatening letters, the days I survived on stale bread just to afford subway fare. It wasn't a war, I whispered, my voice trembling slightly as I tightened my grip on the glass until my knuckles turned white. It was an execution by paperwork. I sat in those sterile, freezing waiting rooms, smelling the constant, nauseating scent of antiseptic and bleach, watching the woman who raised me slowly fade away. I would hold her fragile, bruised hand while administrators in expensive suits handed me itemized invoices I could never hope to pay. $50,000 for a single round of chemotherapy. $10,000 for a week of palliative care. They didn't see a human being fighting for her final breaths. They saw a ledger, a liability. I looked up, meeting his ancient, storm-gray eyes, completely exposing the bitter, resilient core of my grief. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to hide the darkest, most broken pieces of myself. I let him see it all. The exhaustion, the lingering terror, the stubborn, irrational pride that had kept me standing when I should have collapsed. I promised her I would be fine. I promised her I would build a life of my own, that I would use the skills Arthur taught me to create beautiful things. But the moment she died, the debt collectors descended like vultures. Single motherhood was a relentless tide for her, but fighting the financial aftermath of her death was my own personal drowning. I had to become invisible just to survive the crushing weight of it all. Dante remained perfectly still, the firelight catching the faint, silver scar interrupting his left eyebrow. The lethal, ruthless mafia boss vanished entirely, leaving only a deeply protective, fiercely understanding guardian in his wake, an absolute shield. He did not reach for his mufa to issue orders. He simply gave me his undivided, total attention, absorbing the full weight of my trauma. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, closing the physical distance between us, until the intoxicating scent of oud wood and petrichor wrapped around me like a warm, heavy blanket. The sheer size of him, the absolute stillness of his posture, radiated a level of safety I had thought impossible to find in a man like him. You hid your brilliance behind a cheap desk lamp and a frayed sweater, because the world taught you that visibility equals vulnerability, Dante said, his timbre softening to an intimate register that made my heart stutter. He reached across the small mahogany table, his large, calloused knuckles gently brushing against my jawline. His thumb lightly traced the delicate silver wire of the obsidian earring, resting there, the touch so painfully tender it made my lungs ache. It was the unique, handcrafted piece he had retrieved from the marble floor of the gala, the singular artifact that had led him directly to my door. You poured your grief, your anger, and your stubborn resilience into this dark stone. You carved a masterpiece out of volcanic glass, because you understand that true strength is forged under extreme, violent pressure. His hand dropped away, leaving my skin burning in the cool air of the library, but his gaze remained locked onto mine, stripping away every defensive layer I had ever built. The unspoken tension between us was a physical entity, heavy and magnetic, pulling me inexorably toward the very center of his dangerous world. I know the exact weight of the dark, Lauren, the sovereign confessed quietly, leaning back into the shadows of his armchair, exposing a rare, guarded glimpse into his own brutal history. When I took control of this organization, I was 22 years old. My father had been assassinated in the street. Our territories were bleeding out into the harbor, and the men who sat at his table, men who had sworn blood oaths to our family, were actively plotting to divide his empire over his grave. I did not have the luxury of grief. I had to become a monster to ensure my family survived the winter. I had to make decisions that stained my hands permanently, decisions that ensure I will never sleep peacefully in this lifetime. I built these walls, this fortress, out of necessary violence. He looked down at his own hands, resting on his thighs. In the dim light, I could see the faint white lines of old scars crossing his knuckles, the physical map of the extreme violence required to build his impenetrable sanctuary. The people in this city fear me. They see the bespoke suits, the armored vehicles, the absolute command I hold over the underworld, and they believe I am invincible, Dante continued, his baritone rumbling with a heavy, philosophical weariness. But power is an incredibly isolating cage. You are surrounded by hundreds of men who swear loyalty, yet you cannot trust a single one of them to pour your wine. You spend your life looking for the poison hidden in the gold. He looked back up at me, the profound vibrating connection between us crackling with an undeniable magnetic energy. Until 3 nights ago, until a brilliant, terrified appraiser in a burgundy dress looked at my most dangerous artifact and simply told me the truth. The air in the library grew impossibly thin, thick with the unspoken romantic tension that had been steadily building since the moment he touched my wrist in the West End shop. He was the most lethal predator in the city, a predator capable of unleashing catastrophic violence, yet sitting here in the quiet dark, he was offering me a level of emotional safety I had never experienced. We were 2 survivors, scarred and exhausted, recognizing the same fierce, unyielding resilience in each other's eyes. Lorne Mitchell had perfected the art of being invisible. But sitting directly in the sovereign's gaze, I no longer wanted to hide. I did not shrink away. I held his gaze, my heart hammering a frantic, rhythmic beat against my ribs, fully acknowledging the profound shift in my reality. I was no longer running from the shadows. I had found my sanctuary directly in the center of them. The quiet, domestic intimacy of the library lingered well into the following morning, briefly anchored by the warm, earthy scent of Sophia's fresh espresso and the sweet aroma of powdered sugar, dusting the hot sfogliatelle she had prepared in the kitchen. For a few fleeting moments over breakfast, sitting in the sun-drenched breakfast nook, the fortress felt like a genuine home. Sophia had patted my hand gently as she refilled my cup, her warm, maternal presence a stark contrast to the lethal security parameters, operating just outside the reinforced glass. But as I gathered my equipment, that comforting illusion shattered, rapidly replaced by the cold, unforgiving reality of the empire I had sworn to audit. At 9 o'clock, having slept for a few dreamless hours under the heavy silk duvets of my secure quarters, I navigated the grand, sunlit corridors of the estate, carrying my leather satchel toward the security elevator that would take me back to my subterranean laboratory. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows lining the hallway offered sweeping views of the snow-covered Boston skyline, a beautiful, sterile landscape that starkly contrasted with the lethal tension brewing within the walls. I moved with a new sense of purpose, the employment contract I had signed with Dante, acting as an ironclad shield against the chaos of my past. I turned the corner near the formal dining room, my mind already calculating the chemical reagents and hydrostatic weighing formulas required to further document the forged imperial ore coins. I knew exactly what I was going to find in the laboratory today. Electrotypes. Sophisticated replicas created by pressing a mold of the genuine ancient imperial coin and using an electrolytic bath to deposit a thin layer of gold over a core of modern zinc and copper. Solid gold possessed a specific gravity of 1932, a density that could not be faked. Zinc sat at a mere 714. By simply weighing the coins suspended in water, the undeniable mathematical truth would be exposed. Furthermore, the telltale seam along the rim, carefully filed down but still blatantly visible under my 40-power magnification loupe, had already confirmed my worst suspicions. Sterling had not just stolen money. He had gutted the foundational wealth of Dante's empire, replacing priceless historical artifacts with lab-created clones, and pocketing tens of millions in the process. I was so fiercely focused on the metallurgical data and the sheer scale of the impending fallout that I collided abruptly with a solid, unyielding figure. "Watch where you are walking," a sharp, arrogant voice snapped. I stumbled backward, clutching my leather satchel tightly against my chest, and looked up into the cold, condescending face of Julian Sterling. The organization's chief financial officer was the epitome of manufactured, aggressive wealth. He wore a flashy, highly tailored suit in a shade of bright, obnoxious navy that lacked the subtle, bespoke elegance of Dante's wardrobe. His blonde hair was slicked back flawlessly, his skin bearing the artificial, golden tan of frequent trips to exclusive resorts, and he reeked of a heavy, overpowering designer cologne that immediately triggered my gag reflex. But despite the expensive exterior, His micro-expressions betrayed a different story entirely. His pale, watery blue eyes shifted rapidly with an underlying frantic calculation. The slight tremor in his jaw, and the erratic pulse visible at the base of his throat, screamed of a man desperately trying to maintain a facade of control. He was an executive standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down at a crumbling ledger he could no longer hide. My heart slammed violently against my sternum, a cold sweat breaking out across my palms, but I ruthlessly forced my expression to remain perfectly blank, drawing on the years of invisibility I had perfected in the West End. The man standing before me was not a legitimate businessman. He was a ruthless syndicate executive who would not hesitate to silence a threat. "I apologize," I said evenly, stepping aside to give him a wide berth. Sterling did not move. He stepped laterally, deliberately blocking my path to the elevator. His pale eyes swept over my simple black turtleneck and trousers, his lip curling into a distinct sneer of aristocratic disgust. He looked at me the same way the hospital billing administrators had looked at me, like a nuisance, a liability to be swatted away. "You must be the new acquisition," Sterling mocked, his voice dripping with condescension as he invaded my personal space. The little street-level appraiser Mr. Valerius dragged out of some dusty, bankrupt pawnshop. I saw the exorbitant employment contract he forced through the legal department yesterday. A staggering waste of operational capital for a glorified magnifying glass. I tightened my grip on my satchel, my jaw locking. I thought of the precision required to carve the obsidian earring, the years I had spent mastering the chemical properties of rare gemstones. I was not a charity case. I was a master of my craft. I am the personal archive gemologist. I report directly to Mr. Valerius. You report to a man who occasionally lets his charity projects cloud his business judgment. The CFO countered smoothly, taking another step forward until I was forced to press my back against the silk-lined wall of the corridor. The physical intimidation was deliberate, a classic tactic of a weak man, trying to assert dominance over someone he perceived as entirely defenseless. I managed the assets of this organization. I balanced the ledgers. You are currently scheduled to review the Imperial Ore collection. Let me give you a piece of professional advice, Miss Mitchell. Do not attempt to justify your ridiculous salary by finding imaginary flaws in flawless acquisitions. If you disrupt the stability of my portfolios, I will personally ensure you are sent back to whatever poverty-stricken gutter you crawled out of. Permanently. The blatant threat hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He was probing me. He was terrified that my forensic analysis would expose his massive, systemic fraud regarding the ancient reserves, and he was using crude intimidation to force my silence. He expected me to cower. He expected the terrified, exhausted girl who had walked into the Beacon Hill Gala 3 nights ago to lower her eyes and submit to his manufactured authority. But my pride, stubborn and unyielding, flared hot and bright in my chest. I knew exactly what he was. He was a thief, a coward, and a dead man walking. I lifted my chin, staring directly into his watery blue eyes without a single flinch. The stones and the metals do not lie, Mr. Sterling. They hold the microscopic scars of their history. I simply document the truth. If your portfolios are truly flawless, you have absolutely nothing to fear from my magnifying glass. Sterling's face flushed an ugly mottled red, his arrogant mask slipping to reveal the violent, panicking rat beneath. His jaw worked furiously, his meticulously groomed exterior cracking under the sheer pressure of his own guilt. He was a man accustomed to bullying his way out of accounting discrepancies, but he had never faced an auditor who understood the atomic structure of his lies. Sterling raised his hand, his finger pointing aggressively toward my face, opening his mouth to deliver a devastating threat that would undoubtedly involve violence. He never got the chance. Remove yourself from her proximity. Now. The voice did not shout. It did not echo. It was a low, glacial command that instantly dropped the ambient temperature of the corridor by 20 degrees, carrying the lethal, absolute authority of a god rendering a death sentence. Sterling froze, the blood draining completely from his face. He slowly lowered his hand and turned his head. Dante stood at the far end of the hallway. He was flanked by the towering, terrifying presence of Marcus Thorne, but the enforcer was entirely unnecessary. The sovereign himself was a monument of pure, unadulterated violence, tightly contained within a pristine charcoal bespoke suit. He walked toward us, his footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet, his authoritative gaze locked onto Sterling, with a predatory focus that stilled my breath entirely. The underworld boss did not rush. He closed the distance with a terrifying, deliberate grace, stopping exactly 2 feet away from the trembling financial officer. The sheer overwhelming gravity of Dante's presence instantly crushed the trader's manufactured arrogance, reducing the flashy executive to a pathetic, sweating mess. The predator had just revealed itself, and every prey animal in the vicinity suddenly remembered what fear tasted like. "Dante," Sterling stammered, his voice cracking slightly, attempting to pull a confident smile onto his pale face. "I was simply introducing myself to our new archivist, welcoming her to the estate." Dante ignored him completely. He shifted his gaze to me, his dark eyes sweeping over my rigid posture, checking for any physical harm, before returning his lethal focus to the man cowering before him. The shift from absolute protective warmth to cold, calculating murder was instantaneous and terrifying. "You are standing in my hallway, Julian," Dante stated softly, the dangerous vibrato in his baritone echoing against the silk-lined walls. "And you are breathing my archivist's air." The CFO swallowed hard, taking a desperate, frantic step backward, trying to put distance between himself and the apex predator. "Of course, boss. My apologies. I was just on my way to the briefing room." Dante reached out, his hand moving with blinding, viper-like speed, and clamped his large, scarred fingers onto Sterling's expensive silk tie. He did not pull the man forward. He simply held him in place, locking the traitor in a terrifying, inescapable grip. The physical contact was minimal, yet it radiated an unimaginable capacity for violence. "Let me be absolutely, unequivocally clear," Dante whispered, leaning in until his face was mere inches from the sweating executive. "Lauren Mitchell operates under my supreme, absolute protection. She is a master of her craft, and her authority within the archives is an extension of my own. If you ever block her path, question her findings, or speak to her with anything less than total, groveling respect, I will not fire you. I will dismantle you, discreetly and permanently." The threat was not a metaphor. It was a stark, literal promise of execution. Sterling trembled violently in the sovereign's grip, his watery eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He had no idea that his boss already possessed the forensic evidence of his massive embezzlement. He simply thought he had crossed a boundary regarding a favored employee. He nodded frantically, unable to form a coherent sentence, his breathing ragged and shallow. Dante released the silk tie with a slow, deliberate motion, brushing his leather-gloved hand against his trousers, as if he had just touched something deeply contaminated. "Get out of my sight." The traitor scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own expensive shoes, and practically ran down the corridor, disappearing around the corner like a frightened animal fleeing a wildfire. The oppressive, toxic tension in the hallway instantly evaporated, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. Marcus remained stationed at the far end of the corridor, his back turned, securing our perimeter with absolute, discreet professionalism. The massive machinery of the criminal empire continued to churn silently around us, fully mobilized to protect the boundaries Dante had just drawn in blood. I stood perfectly still, my back still pressed against the wall, a violent tremor settling in my chest as my pulse raced in a chaotic, staccato rhythm against my ribs. I had just witnessed the absolute, terrifying power of the man I now worked for. He had not raised his voice. He had not drawn a weapon. He had simply projected his sovereign authority, and one of the most powerful men in the underworld had nearly collapsed in terror. Dante turned to face me. The lethal glacial monster vanished instantly. The storm-gray eyes that had just promised murder softened into a deep, burning wave of protective warmth that physically staggered me. He stepped closer, reaching out to gently cup my elbow, his large hand a solid grounding anchor in the adrenaline-soaked aftermath. "Are you unharmed, Lauren?" he asked quietly, his voice a soothing rumble that immediately began to calm my racing pulse. His gaze flicked over my face, searching for any lingering signs of distress. "I'm fine," I breathed, looking up into his face in sheer awe, my voice barely above a whisper. He was trying to intimidate me. He knows I'm auditing the Imperial Ore. He's terrified I will find the truth. "He is right to be terrified," Dante murmured, his thumb lightly stroking the inside of my elbow, the touch sending a fresh shockwave of heat straight to my core. "But he will never pose a threat to you again. I told you, Lauren, you are completely off-limits to the violence of my world. You are my brilliant mind, I am your shield." I stared up at him, the final remnants of my defensive walls crumbling into dust. The exhausted, invisible girl who had spent years drowning in medical debt and fear was gone. Standing in the sunlit corridor of the heavily guarded fortress, perfectly protected by the most dangerous man in Boston. I realized the absolute truth. I was exactly where I belonged, and Julian Sterling was about to face the poetic justice of a lifetime. 72 hours later, the atmosphere in the private subterranean auction house of the Valerius Syndicate felt heavy enough to crush bone. The clandestine venue was hidden deep beneath the concrete foundation of a nondescript commercial shipping warehouse on the freezing edge of the Boston Harbor, but the interior architecture was a staggering, highly secure monument to unapologetic, aggressive wealth. The cavernous walls were lined in dark, acoustic, dampening mahogany, designed specifically by master craftsmen to absorb the hushed, illicit negotiations of the criminal elite and prevent any sound from breaching the perimeter. The air inside the massive facility was thick and suffocating, smelling heavily of rich, imported Cuban cigar smoke, spilled vintage cognac, and the distinct metallic tang of ruthless, unchecked ambition. This was a completely different ecosystem from the Beacon Hill Historical Society gala I had fled 3 nights prior. There were no oblivious politicians seeking positive press, no naive socialites draped in borrowed pearls, and no string quartets masking the predatory nature of the attendees. These opposite bosses occupying the plush, tiered velvet seating of the main floor were apex predators, hardened capos, heavily guarded lieutenants, and allied overlords who controlled the violent, lucrative undercurrents of Boston and its surrounding territories. They operated entirely outside the boundaries of orthodox law, their empires driven by blood oaths, territorial violence, and absolute financial leverage. I sat in the highly secure elevated viewing gallery, overlooking the main auction floor, separated from the volatile crime lords by 2 inches of reinforced, ballistic glass. I was no longer wearing the scratchy synthetic fabric of the second-hand burgundy dress that had clung uncomfortably to my ribs on the night of the security breach. Sophia Moretti had meticulously arranged for a bespoke midnight blue silk gown that draped flawlessly over my frame, the expensive, heavy fabric feeling like cool water against my skin. It was a physical, undeniable manifestation of my new reality, a stark, sudden departure from the frayed olive-green sweaters and constant, bone-deep exhaustion that had defined my life in the West End. Yet, the most important accessory I wore was not provided by Dante's immense wealth or his high-end tailors. Settled securely against my left jawline was the obsidian earring, a unique, hand-carved, dark volcanic glass, nestled inside its delicate silver filigree, catching the low, amber light of the private gallery. It remained my professional signature, my steadfast anchor, and a constant tactile reminder of the grueling labor and uncompromising intellect that had brought me out of the shadows and to this exact pivotal moment. I pressed my fingertips against the cold glass of the viewing gallery, my pulse maintaining a steady, elevated rhythm. The journey from Arthur Pendleton's drafty, dust-filled restoration shop to this fortified command center felt like a surreal, impossible leap across lifetimes. I thought about the towering stack of overdue medical bills that had once threatened to completely suffocate me, the predatory collection calls that had kept me awake at 3 in the morning, and the sheer desperate panic that had driven me to accept the evaluation job at the gala in the first place. All of those terrors seemed to belong to a different woman now. The employment contract I had signed with Dante Valerius, a legally binding fortress in itself, had instantly vaporized the crushing financial weight that had anchored me to the bottom of the ocean. My mother's medical care was fully funded in a secure trust. My debts were zeroed out. But the true terrifying test of my new life was playing out directly below me, on a stage built for kings and monsters. Directly below my vantage point, Julian Sterling sat in the center of the front row, radiating a toxic manufactured confidence that made my stomach turn. The organization's chief financial officer wore another flashy, highly tailored bespoke suit in a shade of aggressive navy, sipping expensive champagne from a crystal flute while conversing smoothly with a neighboring cartel boss. His blonde hair was perfectly slicked back, and his pale, watery blue eyes scanned the opulent room with smug, unearned satisfaction. He firmly believed he had already won the war. He believed that his aggressive, physical intimidation tactics in the sunlit corridor of the estate had successfully terrified the new, street-level appraiser into absolute silence. He sat there, entirely convinced that the highly anticipated auction would proceed smoothly, that he would effortlessly collect his massive, hidden percentage from the sale of the fraudulent reserves, and that his systemic, years-long embezzlement would remain permanently buried in the syndicate's encrypted ledgers. Julian was a creature of calculated arrogance, a figure who had manipulated spreadsheets and leveraged fear to climb to the absolute pinnacle of Boston's underworld hierarchy. He did not possess the raw, instinctual dominance of the enforcers, nor did he command the fierce loyalty that Dante inspired effortlessly. Julian relied entirely on deception. He had constructed an empire of lies on the assumption that no one in the syndicate possessed the highly specialized, esoteric knowledge required to question his financial assertions. He had looked at the Imperial Ore coins and seen an opportunity to hollow out the organization from the inside, replacing priceless historical artifacts with cheap, lab-created replicas. And when I had uncovered his treason in the subterranean laboratory, he had attempted to crush me under the weight of his authority, assuming I was nothing more than a fragile, expendable obstacle. He had gravely miscalculated. The low, buzzing hum of underworld conversation ceased abruptly, cut off as if a switch had been flipped, the moment Dante Valerius stepped onto the central stage. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and terrifying. Dante did not demand their silence. His mere physical presence instantly commanded it from the lungs of every powerful leader present. The sovereign ruler wore a pristine, midnight black tuxedo that was tailored to devastating perfection, making him look like a creeping shadow given solid, authoritative form. He moved with that terrifying, predatory grace, stepping up to the polished oak auctioneer's block without a single note or ledger in his hands. His ancient, piercing gaze locked instantaneously onto mine. He paused his speech, his piercing gaze panning slowly across the room until it locked directly onto Julian Sterling in the front row. Julian offered a tight, deferential nod, his arrogant mask still perfectly intact, completely unaware of the heavy razor-sharp blade hovering silently over his neck. With a minimal, highly precise gesture of his right hand, Dante signaled his security chief. Marcus Thorns materialized instantly from the dark shadows near the wings of the stage, his black tactical suit a stark, dangerous contrast to the formal evening wear of the attendees. The enforcer silently wheeled out a series of heavy, climate-sealed glass display cases, positioning them meticulously under the harsh, direct spotlights at the exact center of the stage. Sitting on the plush black velvet, within the reinforced cases, were the 50 Imperial Ore coins, the alleged foundational wealth of the syndicate's alternative asset portfolio. The ancient gold caught the intense light, gleaming with a false, manufactured brilliance that I now knew, with absolute scientific certainty, was nothing more than a highly sophisticated, lab-created lie. Capos, Dante's resonant baritone vibrated smoothly through the state-of-the-art acoustic system, carrying a grave, uncompromising weight that immediately demanded total obedience. Tonight, we were scheduled to auction the absolute bedrock of our physical reserves, the early Imperial Roman gold. For years, we have relied on the assurance that our collective wealth was anchored deep in history. We believed our financial foundation was pure, unadulterated, and entirely immune to the fluctuating vulnerabilities of the modern global economy. Dante paused his speech, his piercing gaze panning slowly across the room until it locked directly onto Julian Sterling in the front row. Julian offered a tight, deferential nod, his arrogant mask still perfectly intact, completely unaware of the heavy, razor-sharp blade hovering silently over his neck. But power is an incredibly isolating cage. The underworld boss continued softly, his tone dropping to a dangerous, lethal register that made the air in the vast room feel suddenly thin. It breeds a very specific, dangerous kind of blindness. It allows parasites to hide in the dark shadows of our own ledgers, relying on our assumed trust to mask their devastating, insatiable greed. Dante reached out and pressed a single button on the oak podium, and the massive digital screen spanning the entire back wall of the stage, suddenly illuminated with a blinding white light. It did not display a traditional catalog of starting bids, lot numbers, or historical provenance documents. Instead, it projected the high-definition microphotographs I had taken through the optical lens of my stereo microscope in the subterranean laboratory. A collective, confused murmur rippled through the crowd of hardened syndicate bosses as they stared up at the highly magnified, irregular surface of a gold coin, struggling to comprehend the meaning of the image. Ancient coins were struck entirely by hand with a heavy iron hammer, Dante explained, flawlessly delivering my exact forensic data with the cold, surgical precision of an executioner reading a formal death sentence. Because of that crude metallurgical process, they possess organic, violently compressed borders. What you are currently observing on this screen, running along the extreme outer perimeter of the rim, is a mathematically perfect manufacturing seam. These are not hammered coins. They are high-level electrotypes. Someone created perfect silicone molds of our genuine artifacts, utilized an electrolytic bath to deposit a microscopic shell of gold, and filled the hollow center with a dense, worthless modern alloy. Julian Sterling's posture abruptly stiffened, his spine locking rigid against the velvet chair. The smug, manufactured confidence instantly evaporated from his face, replaced by a sudden, chalky pallor that mirrored the color of bleached bone. His watery blue eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as the realization of his exposure crashed over him. The digital screen transitioned seamlessly, flashing the stark red numbers of my hydrostatic balance readouts. Pure ancient gold holds a specific gravity of 19.32, Dante declared, his voice echoing like thunder in the silent, mahogany-lined room. The pieces displayed in these cases registered at exactly 18.85. The screen shifted one final time, displaying the volatile, spiked graphs of the X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. Furthermore, molecular bombardment reveals that these coins contain modern, refined zinc and copper trace elements. It is chemically impossible for these objects to be ancient. The imperial ore coins you see before you are worthless forgeries. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed the revelation was absolute. The criminal elite stared at the undeniable, empirical evidence of their financial devastation, the terrifying realization that their untouchable reserves were completely worthless swept through the room like a physical shockwave. Figures who had built their entire livelihoods on the assumption of this wealth now realized they had been systematically robbed. The magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. This is not an external attack from a rival family, Dante stated, stepping out from behind the podium, his broad shoulders squared as he embraced the full, terrifying mantle of the sovereign. This is a systemic, catastrophic infection orchestrated from within my own inner circle. A treason designed to hollow out our empire from the inside out. Dante's obsidian gaze locked entirely onto the chief financial officer. Julian's hand trembled so uncontrollably that the expensive crystal champagne flute slipped from his fingers. It shattered against the polished hardwood floor in an explosion of glass and spilled alcohol, the sharp noise screaming like a siren in a silent room. "Boss. Dante, this is a terrible mistake," Sterling stammered, his voice cracking pitifully as he hastily scrambled to his feet, desperately trying to salvage the crumbling, burning architecture of his lies. The provenance of those coins was heavily verified by global experts. That street-level appraiser you brought in, Lauren Mitchell, she doesn't understand the complexities of the antiquities market. She is fabricating metallurgical data to justify her ridiculous employment contract. Dante did not shout. He did not exhibit any of the chaotic, volatile violence typical of a betrayed mob boss. He simply walked slowly, deliberately to the edge of the stage, looming over the panicked executive like a god of war. The surrounding syndicate bosses hastily scrambled out of their plush velvet seats, pushing themselves away from the traitor, as if the figure were actively radiating a lethal plague. "The stones and the metals do not lie, Julian," Dante whispered, though the state-of-the-art acoustics carried his glacial, terrifying promise to every dark corner of the vast warehouse. "They hold the microscopic scars of their history. You gutted my empire. You replaced our blood with cheap zinc and copper. And you believed your manufactured arrogance would blind me forever. You believed I would never find a mind brilliant enough to see the poison hidden in your gold." The complete deconstruction of his authority left Sterling utterly paralyzed, trapped in the crosshairs of the sovereign he had betrayed. The flashy, arrogant executive who had cornered me in the sunlit corridors of the Beacon Hill estate, aggressively threatening to send me back to the poverty-stricken gutter, was entirely gone. He was reduced to a sweating, hyperventilating mess, his watery blue eyes darting frantically around the expansive room, searching for a single ally among the criminal elite. But there was no mercy to be found. The associates who had shared his expensive cigars, toasted to his financial acumen, and laughed at his jokes, now stared at him with cold, predatory contempt. In the unforgiving, brutal ecosystem of the underworld, extreme betrayal demanded extreme retribution, and Julian was completely isolated, standing entirely alone on the precipice of his own destruction. "Remove him from my sight, Dante," commanded softly, turning his broad back on the ruined traitor in a gesture of ultimate, devastating dismissal. Marcus Thorne materialized from the shadows of the center aisle with blinding, lethal efficiency. The enforcer did not draw his weapon. He did not need to. The absolute, coordinated discipline of Dante's security apparatus required no chaotic violence. Marcus stepped behind him, silent, lethal. With a swift, methodical motion, Marcus grasped Julian's wrists, violently twisting them behind his back. The cold, metallic click of heavy tactical steel handcuffs locking securely into place echoed sharply through the cavernous auction house. It was the definitive, inescapable sound of absolute ruin. "No, Dante, please, I can fix the ledgers, I can track down the original buyers," Sterling begged, his voice pitching into a pathetic, high-frequency shriek as Marcus forcibly shoved him forward toward the exit. His highly tailored navy suit was badly rumpled, the expensive fabric twisting awkwardly, as he struggled in vain against the enforcer's unyielding grip. His polished leather shoes scuffed desperately against the floor, leaving dark marks on the wood, but he was entirely powerless against the sheer, physical dominance of Marcus Thorne. Julian was dragged backward down the center aisle, paraded in utter disgrace before the entire hierarchy of the Boston Syndicate. His public humiliation was complete and total. He was stripped of his wealth, his status, and his dignity, reduced to a weeping, broken traitor, being escorted into the dark, punishing abyss of the underworld's justice system. The heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the warehouse swung open, and Marcus thrust the sobbing executive out into the freezing night, the doors slamming shut behind them with a definitive, echoing thud. I stood in the elevated viewing gallery, my hands pressed flat against the cold ballistic glass, my breath hitching sharply in my chest. The emotional payoff washing over me was a staggering, overwhelming tidal wave of pure catharsis. For 3 years I had been systematically crushed by a society that ignored my intellect and penalized my poverty. I had sat in sterile, freezing hospital waiting rooms, terrified and invisible, watching administrators in expensive suits hand me itemized medical bills that I knew would inevitably destroy my life. I had spent countless, grueling hours in Arthur Pendleton's drafty shop, my fingers bleeding and cramping as I repaired the neglected treasures of the wealthy, constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified of the next final notice, the next predatory collection call. Predators exactly like Julian Sterling, ruthless figures who utilize their vast financial leverage to intimidate, exploit, and crush the working class, had dictated the desperate, suffocating boundaries of my entire adult existence. But tonight, that cycle broke. I hadn't just survived his intimidation in the hallway. I had utterly dismantled him. My calloused hands, my obsessive, poverty-driven training, and my uncompromising dedication to the empirical truth of gemology had proven vastly more powerful than his tens of millions in stolen capital. I had taken the forensic evidence, the microscopic flaws, and the hydrostatic data, and I had forged a blade sharp enough to sever the neck of a syndicate titan. The poetic justice of the moment was profoundly intoxicating. The rival who had sneered at my cheap sweaters and threatened my life was now riding in the back of an armored SUV in tight steel handcuffs, facing a brutal underworld tribunal, while I stood safely in a bespoke silk gown, holding the supreme professional validation of the most dangerous empire in the city. The silence on the main auction floor remained thick and heavy, the criminal elite still processing the monumental display of sovereign authority they had just witnessed. Dante Valerius stood alone at the center of the stage, a towering, unyielding monument of absolute power. He had just excised a massive, systemic cancer from his organization without firing a single shot, utilizing the sheer brilliance of the trap we had set to reassert his unquestionable dominance over the syndicate. He was the apex predator, entirely in control of his territory. Then, slowly, the sovereign turned away from the crowd. He didn't look at his stunned lieutenants. He didn't look at the shattered crystal champagne flute lying on the floor. He tilted his head back, his dark, aristocratic features catching the harsh glare of the halogen spotlights, and looked directly up at the elevated viewing gallery. Through the dim, smoky lighting of the warehouse, through 2 inches of reinforced ballistic glass, his ancient, thunderous eyes were locked entirely onto my stunned face. The unspoken, magnetic tension that crackled between us instantly obliterated the physical distance. The terrifying glacial monster who had just ruined an enemy's life vanished completely from his expression. In its place, a fierce, burning wave of profound protective warmth and absolute reverence radiated from his gaze, reaching me with the undeniable force of a physical touch. He was not looking at an employee or a hired appraiser. He was publicly, silently crowning me as the brilliant architect of his salvation, acknowledging that my mind was the only thing that had saved his empire from catastrophic collapse. I did not look away. My heart hammered a frantic, triumphant rhythm against my ribs as I raised my trembling hand, my dark-stained fingertips gently brushing against the cold silver filigree of the obsidian earring settled on my jawline. Lauren Mitchell had perfected the art of being invisible. But standing under the heavy, intoxicating gravity of Dante's gaze, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never have to hide in the shadows ever again. I was finally seen. 2 weeks had passed since the gavel fell at the subterranean auction, permanently erasing Julian Sterling from the hierarchy of the Boston underworld. The chaotic, volatile energy that had saturated the Beacon Hill estate during the forensic audit had slowly dissipated, replaced by a profound, heavily guarded serenity. I had spent the ensuing days meticulously recataloguing the genuine historical assets in the lower vaults, ensuring the syndicate's true wealth was accurately documented and secured. The forensic equipment in my matte gray laboratory had become my daily refuge, a space where I could impose absolute, empirical order upon a world built on shadows and leverage. I found a strange comfort in the rigid parameters of my optical microscope and the undeniable truth of a spectrometer reading. Here, beneath layers of reinforced concrete and biometric security, the crippling anxiety of my past financial ruin felt like a distant, faded echo. But this morning, the routine was deliberately, intriguingly broken. At exactly 10 o'clock, Marcus Thorne appeared at the reinforced door of my subterranean lab. The enforcer did not deliver a stack of ancient ledgers or a velvet tray of suspect gems. Instead, he offered a single, rigid nod and informed me that Dante requested my presence in the west wing of the estate, a section of the sprawling, historic mansion I had not yet been permitted to explore. The sudden deviation from our established professional protocol sent a sharp, involuntary spike of anticipation through my nervous system. I secured my digital calipers, returning them to their velvet-lined case with practiced efficiency. I locked the heavy steel safes containing the authenticated Imperial RA, double-checking the biometric seals out of sheer habit, and followed the silent security chief through the labyrinthine corridors. We bypassed the grand library and the formal dining rooms, transitioning into a sunlit, architectural marvel of glass and reinforced steel that overlooked the vast private grounds of the compound. The air here was different. It did not smell of ancient, decaying paper, cold concrete, or the sharp tang of testing acids. It smelled faintly of fresh paint, polished mahogany, and the crisp, clean scent of winter sunlight hitting cold glass. Marcus stopped in front of a set of heavy, frosted glass double doors, stepped back into the shadows without a single word of explanation, and gestured for me to enter alone. I pushed the heavy doors open, the precision hinges gliding with absolute silence. I stepped across the threshold and stopped dead, the oxygen violently leaving my lungs. It was not a tactical briefing room. It was not another sterile forensic laboratory designed for dismantling lies and hunting down internal syndicate treason. It was a staggering, sun-drenched design studio, custom-built to be the ultimate creative sanctuary. The sheer scale and specificity of the space were breathtaking. Enormous, floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the room with pure, unadulterated natural light, an absolute necessity for accurately grading and setting raw gemstones, without the deceptive interference of artificial bulbs. In the center of the expansive room sat a sprawling, custom-milled jeweler's workbench, crafted from solid dark walnut, its surface completely unblemished and smelling richly of natural oil. But it was the equipment that truly anchored me to the floorboards. Along the far wall, a row of state-of-the-art induction melting furnaces and programmable burnout kilns stood ready, their digital displays glowing with quiet, mechanical potential. There were pristine, polished steel anvils, high-torque micromotors for precision engraving, and a sophisticated laser welder that cost more than Arthur Pendleton's entire West End property. Every single tool was precisely calibrated, laid out with surgical exactness. The forensic laboratory was built to protect my past, Lauren. A low, resonant baritone vibrated through the sunlit space. Dante Valerius stepped out from the alcove near the windows. The sovereign ruler wore a flawlessly tailored, charcoal bespoke suit without a tie, the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt undone to reveal the strong, corded lines of his throat. He moved with that terrifying, predatory grace, closing the physical distance between us until the intoxicating, heavy scent of aged, single malt whiskey and sharp petrichor wrapped round my senses. He did not look at the millions of dollars worth of industrial design equipment. His ancient, thunderous eyes were locked entirely onto my stunned face, burning with a fierce, possessive pride. This space, Dante continued softly, stopping mere inches from me, was built exclusively for your future. I slowly walked toward the central walnut workbench, my trembling fingers reaching out to brush against a series of transparent, acrylic display boxes resting on the surface. Inside the containers were raw, uncut precious stones. There were rough, unheated Ceylon sapphires still encased in their natural, hexagonal crystal habits, deep red pigeon blood rubies from Mogok that practically glowed with internal fire, and heavy, solid ingots of pure 24-karat gold and raw platinum. It was an absolute treasure trove of raw, elemental potential, waiting for a master artisan to shape it. For years, I had scavenged through scrap bins, carefully melting down broken, discarded pawnshop chains just to have enough viable metal to practice my craft. I had carved my signature obsidian rose, using chipped, second-hand files under a flickering, unreliable desk lamp while holding my breath against the threatening knocks of debt collectors. The sheer, overwhelming abundance resting before me was incomprehensible. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the acoustic-perfected studio. "My employment contract dictates that I authenticate your historical archives. I am your forensic gemologist. I document the history of the stones you already possess." Dante reached out, his large, scarred hand gently picking up a matte black leather portfolio from the edge of the workbench. He held it out to me. "Your forensic duties require perhaps 10 hours of your week. The remainder of your time belongs to your true calling. Open it." I took the heavy leather folder, my dark-stained fingertips shaking violently as I flipped the cover back. Inside was a stack of immaculate, legally binding corporate documents. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense, sophisticated legalese, my highly trained analytical mind parsing the structure of the agreements. It was a full corporate incorporation for a luxury LLC, registered entirely in my name. The capitalization clauses were staggering, detailing an unlimited, fully funded operational budget underwritten by the Valerius Syndicate's legitimate holding companies. It guaranteed complete autonomy over creative direction, sourcing, and distribution. It was complete, unassailable financial backing for a custom-designed jewelry line. My jewelry line. "You spent your entire adult life pouring your brilliance into repairing the neglected, broken items of a society that refused to see your worth," Dante murmured, stepping directly behind me. The radiating, intense heat of his broad chest was a solid protective wall against my back, triggering a sudden, electric spike in my pulse. I could feel the deep vibration of his voice resonating through my own ribs. "You forged that exquisite obsidian earring in the dark, carving a masterpiece out of volcanic glass, while drowning in predatory medical debt. You hid your genius because visibility meant vulnerability." He reached around me, his leather-gloved hands resting flat on the walnut workbench on either side of my hips, effectively trapping me in a cage of his own devastating power. It was a highly dominant territorial posture, yet it carried absolutely no threat. It was a physical manifestation of his absolute, uncompromising protection. "You will never hide again, Lauren," Dante vowed, his voice dropping to a low, quiet rasp against the curve of my neck. "You are not merely a restorer, you are a creator. This studio, these raw materials, this corporate entity, they are yours. You will design your own collections. You will dictate the terms of your art, and I will ensure that the entire world recognizes the master artisan who saved my empire." The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his gift shattered the final, stubborn remnants of the defensive walls I had built around my heart. He had not just paid off my debts, or given me a lucrative salary to buy my submission. He had looked at the deepest, most desperate ambition of my soul. The fierce, unyielding desire to create beautiful things without the suffocating weight of poverty crushing my hands. And he had manifested it into absolute reality. He was elevating me from a struggling, invisible worker to a prominent, heavily guarded designer, utilizing his immense underworld leverage to build me a throne of my own. Tears, hot and fast, finally spilled over my lower lashes, tracking silently down my pale cheeks. I did not try to hide them. I turned slowly within the cage of his arms, looking up into the dangerous, perfect face of the man who had completely rewritten the trajectory of my existence. The storm-gray eyes that terrified the criminal elite were looking down at me with a profound, terrifying tenderness. "You built this for me in 2 weeks?" I breathed, my hands lifting instinctively to rest flat against the crisp, expensive cotton of his dress shirt. I could feel the heavy, steady thud of his heartbeat beneath my palms, a grounding, vital rhythm that completely anchored my chaotic emotions. I would burn this city to the foundation and rebuild it brick by brick if it meant you would never have to look over your shoulder again. Dante confessed softly, his baritone thick with an unspoken magnetic tension that made the oxygen in the sunlit room feel impossibly thin. He raised his right hand, the rough pad of his thumb gently sweeping away a tear from my cheekbone. The touch was searing, an electric connection that sent a violent, involuntary shiver racing down my spine. I leaned into his palm, closing my eyes and entirely surrendering to the overwhelming, intoxicating safety of his presence. I had spent years analyzing the microscopic flaws in precious stones, searching for the hidden poison, the deceptive treatments, the structural weaknesses. But standing in the center of the sun-drenched studio, held by the most formidable boss in Boston, I found absolutely no deception. There was only the brutal, uncompromising truth of his devotion. Hours later, as the brief, weak afternoon sun dipped below the Boston skyline, the ambient temperature of the estate began to plummet. The first major winter storm of the season had finally broken over the city, blanketing the historic streets of Beacon Hill in a thick, silent layer of pristine white snow. I was sitting at my new walnut workbench, my fingers expertly drafting the preliminary geometric sketches for a complex platinum collar, entirely lost in the pure, unadulterated flow state of creation. I calculated the exact tensile strength required for the hinge mechanisms, my mind mathematical and sharply focused. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had once defined my creative process was completely gone, replaced by a fierce, driving inspiration. The heavy studio doors opened quietly, and Dante stepped back into the room. He had changed into a thick, dark wool turtleneck that emphasized the broad, lethal lines of his shoulders, carrying a heavy, bespoke cashmere overcoat draped over his arm. "Leave the sketches for tomorrow, Lauren," the sovereign commanded softly, his eyes locking onto mine with a dark, intense purpose that immediately accelerated my pulse. "Walk with me." I set my graphite pencil down on the drafting paper, the sudden shift in his demeanor capturing my absolute attention. I stood up, smoothing the front of my simple, tailored black trousers, and walked toward him. Without a word, Dante stepped behind me, unfolding the incredibly soft cashmere overcoat and draping it gently over my shoulders. The garment dwarfed my smaller frame, smelling intensely of his signature oud wood and petrichor, instantly cocooning me in a layer of his physical warmth. He led me out of the studio, bypassing the main corridors, and navigating through a series of discreet, highly secure glass corridors until we reached the heavy, reinforced doors leading to the estate's private, walled winter garden. Marcus Thorne was stationed at the exit, as always, his posture rigid and alert. But at a subtle nod from Dante, the enforcer stepped back, unlocking the doors and allowing us to step out into the freezing night alone. The absolute silence of the falling snow was deafening. The private garden was a sprawling, meticulously manicured sanctuary, heavily fortified by high stone walls, and state-of-the-art perimeter security cameras that hummed quietly in the dark, yet it felt like an untouched, ancient forest. Towering oak trees, their bare branches, coated in thick, glittering frost, stood like silent sentinels in the shadows. The cold air was sharp and biting, stinging my cheeks instantly. But the heavy cashmere coat and the radiating, furnace-like heat of Dante's body beside me kept the winter chill completely at bay. Our footsteps crunched softly in unison against the fresh powder as we walked along the winding, granite-paved path. "The night of the gala, when you fled into the alleyway," Dante began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that cut cleanly through the freezing air. He did not look at me, his gaze fixed on the frozen, tiered stone fountain at the center of the garden. My security network had already flagged the perimeter breach. I could have easily intercepted you before you ever reached the service doors. I could have demanded you stay and answer for the chaotic exit. "Why didn't you?" I asked quietly, pulling the collar of his coat tighter around my neck, the memory of that terrifying, frantic escape flashing vividly in my mind. The spilled wine spreading like blood, the blaring alarms, the screaming socialites, the sheer, blinding panic of thinking my entire career was over. "Because a caged bird will inevitably break its own wings against the bars," Dante replied. stopping near the edge of the frozen fountain and turning to face me. The ambient light from the estate windows caught the falling snowflakes, casting a soft, ethereal glow over his sharp, aristocratic features. I knew that if I forced you to remain in my presence that night, you would view me solely as another predator. Another wealthy, powerful man, leveraging your vulnerability to extract compliance. You had spent your entire life running from men who sought to exploit your brilliance. I needed you to understand with absolute certainty that I am not your warden. I am your shield. The raw, unvarnished honesty of his admission hung in the frigid air, heavy and intoxicating. He was a man who ruled a violent, unforgiving underworld, a sovereign who demanded absolute obedience from killers and thieves. Yet he had exercised a terrifying level of patience and restraint solely to earn my genuine trust. He had given me the space to run, knowing he would simply track the microscopic maker's mark on my dropped earring to find me when the time was right. You brought me into a fortress, Dante, I whispered, stepping closer to him, the physical pull between us an undeniable magnetic force. You surrounded me with armed guards, you locked me behind biometric steel doors, and you handed me the power to destroy your highest-ranking officers. You didn't just give me a shield. You gave me a loaded weapon and told me to aim, because you are the only person in this world who sees the truth, Dante murmured fiercely. He reached out, his large, bare hands gently framing my face. The contrast between the freezing winter air and the searing heat of his skin sent a violent, electric shockwave straight to my core. I live in a world comprised entirely of forged loyalties and calculated deception. Every smile I receive is a transaction. Every blood oath is a temporary convenience. But you, Lauren, you look at the most dangerous artifacts in my possession. You look at the violence in my history, and you do not flinch. You do not lie to me. You are the only flawless, authentic thing in my entire empire. My breath hitched audibly, my heart hammering a frantic, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. The unspoken, high-wire, romantic tension that had been steadily building between us since the moment he touched my wrist in the West End shop finally reached its absolute, critical mass. Dante slowly lowered his right hand, reaching into the pocket of his dark wool trousers. He withdrew his hand, his long, scarred fingers holding a small, matte black velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. Such a submissive, conventional gesture did not belong in the brutal, sovereign reality we inhabited. Instead, he held the box between us, his silver-gray eyes burning with a fierce, uncompromising devotion that completely eclipsed the freezing Boston winter. With a smooth, deliberate motion, he flipped the lid open. Resting on the dark velvet was a ring that stole the breath straight from my burning lungs. It was not a mass-produced, gaudy diamond meant to loudly broadcast superficial wealth. It was a masterpiece of bespoke, lethal elegance. The center stone was a breathtaking, unheated natural blue sapphire, a direct, poetic contrast to the fraudulent, heat-treated forgery I had exposed at the gala. Its color was a deep, mesmerizing, velvety midnight blue, possessing the rare, natural rutile silk inclusions that proved its authentic, uncorrupted history. I could see the masterful precision of the pavilion facets, engineered to bounce light perfectly back through the crown. But it was the setting that made the tears spill over my lashes. Flanking the breathtaking sapphire were two tiny, meticulously hand-carved obsidian roses, set within a complex, intricate web of platinum filigree that perfectly matched the architecture of the earring, currently resting against my left jawline. He had commissioned a piece that explicitly honored my own craftsmanship, seamlessly integrating my professional signature with his immense wealth. It was a physical, undeniable declaration of equality. I am not asking you to submit to my authority, Lauren, Dante stated, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that vibrated directly against my soul. He carefully removed the heavy platinum ring from the velvet box. I am asking you to stand beside me, to be the queen of this fortress, to hold the truth of my empire in your brilliant, calloused hands, and to let me spend the rest of my life ensuring that you never, ever have to be invisible again. I looked down at the breathtaking sapphire, then up into the ancient, unwavering eyes of the sovereign who had completely dismantled the toxic, suffocating boundaries of my past. The grueling 14-hour shifts at Arthur's shop, the terrifying collection letters, the panic of the charity auction. They were entirely erased, burned away by the fierce, absolute safety of his presence. I had spent my life reading the microscopic scars of history, searching for the flaws, but looking at Dante Valerius, I saw only an unbreakable, absolute promise. Yes, I breathed, my voice barely audible over the soft rustle of the falling snow, but carrying the heavy, unyielding weight of an absolute vow. Dante's jaw tightened with a profound, victorious emotion. He reached out, taking my trembling, dark-stained left hand in his. With slow, deliberate precision, he slid the heavy platinum and sapphire ring onto my finger. The cold metal quickly absorbed the heat of my skin, the tiny obsidian roses settling perfectly against the base of my knuckle. The fit was absolutely flawless, calculated with the same ruthless, obsessive attention to detail he applied to every facet of his empire. The exact moment the ring cleared my knuckle, Dante pulled me flush against his chest, his large hand tangled in the hair at the nape of my neck, tilting my head back as he finally closed the distance, his mouth capturing mine in a searing, absolute claim that tasted of winter wind and aged whiskey. The single lost obsidian earring had shattered the invisible cage of my past, leading the most dangerous predator in the city directly to my door. But as I wrapped my arms around his neck, holding the sovereign who had rewritten my destiny, I knew I had finally found my permanent sanctuary in his shadows.